Chapter 16. Cash. I'd always believed there was a way to balance any ledger, that every loss could be offset by a gain if you were patient enough to find the right numbers and ruthless enough to move them where they belonged. Savannah walking out of his life proved there were deficits no amount of money or intelligence could fix. The office felt wrong without her. Too quiet despite the hum of computers and the faint vibration of the club moving around the compound outside. Every time he looked at the empty chair across from his desk, it felt like staring at a missing line item that refused to be reconciled. He replayed the last look she'd given him on a loop, the way her eyes had gone distant and wounded all at once, as if she'd already begun the work of cutting him out of her future before the door had even closed behind her. He threw himself into work because that was what he did best when everything else went to hell, burying himself in spreadsheets and projections, adjusting cash flow between legitimate fronts and the darker veins of the club's income. Still, Savannah's absence bled into everything he touched. Numbers blurred, patterns he would normally catch in seconds slipped past him, and more than once he found himself staring at a screen without actually seeing it. His thoughts drifted back to the way she'd stood in that same room and told him she couldn't trust him anymore. Trust was a fragile thing. He'd learned that young, but he'd never expected to want it this badly from anyone, let alone a woman who'd walked into his life with a calculator and a backbone made of steel. Ryder noticed before he'd said a word, because Ryder always noticed when one of his officers was off. He stepped into the office without knocking, closing the door behind him, and leaned against it with a look that said this wasn't a casual check-in. "Where's Savannah?" Ryder asked, his eyes moving once around the room before settling on Cash. Compounds felt like a storm waiting to break all week. Cash didn't bother pretending everything was fine. He didn't lift his gaze from the ledger in front of him. "She left. I pushed her there. Tried to control the situation instead of trusting her with it." He set down his pen. "Used leverage I shouldn't have. She called it what it was and walked." Ryder was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he took that in. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, not unkind but unyielding. "You don't get to bleed all over the books and call it business. If she matters to you, you fight for her the same way you fight for this club, or you accept the loss and live with it." He pushed off the door. "But don't pretend this doesn't affect all of us." "I know," Cash said, and he meant it. Savannah had already become a variable that could destabilize more than just his heart if he didn't handle it right. And the thought of accepting a life without her felt worse than any fallout that might come from trying to get her back. He tried calling her that night, stepping outside onto the gravel lot where the air smelled like oil and cold steel, but the call went straight to voicemail, her recorded voice a knife twisting in his chest. He didn't leave a message the first time or the second. He paced between parked bikes like a caged animal, running through every possible angle, every argument and apology. When he finally spoke after the third call, his voice was rougher than he liked, stripped of the control he usually wielded like a weapon. "Savannah, it's me. I'm not calling to explain myself or talk my way out of what I did, so don't delete this yet." He stopped pacing. "I fucked up. I know that. I used what I knew about you to keep you in line instead of just being straight with you. And you deserved better than that." A beat of silence. "I need to see you, not as the club's treasurer, as someone who loves you and doesn't know how to let you go. That's all. Call me back." Days passed without a response, and the silence gnawed at him in a way violence never could, because there was nothing to hit or intimidate into submission, no enemy to track and neutralize. He sent her flowers once, then cursed himself for how cliché it felt. But when he pictured them sitting in her apartment, a small sign he hadn't stopped thinking about her, he decided he didn't care. He showed up outside her building once, sitting in his truck across the street like a ghost, haunting his own life, watching the windows light up and go dark, forcing himself not to cross the line into something that would only push her further away. The club felt it too. His temper ran closer to the surface, and his patience wore thin. More than one brother gave him a wide berth after watching him snap at a prospect over a minor accounting error. "You want to tell me what the problem is?" the prospect had asked, and the look Cash gave him shut that conversation down cold. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, that letting his personal life bleed into club business could cost them all. That knowledge only sharpened the ache in his chest because it meant he had to keep functioning as if nothing was wrong when everything was. Late one night, alone in his office again, he poured himself a drink he didn't need and stared at the city lights beyond the compound. He drafted an email he never sent, then another, each one more raw than the last, confessing things he'd never put into words, not even to himself. About the kid who'd grown up counting other people's money and learning early that numbers were safer than emotions. Savannah had cracked that armor without even trying, had seen through the careful distance he kept from everyone else, and instead of using it against him, she'd offered him something real. Losing that felt like losing the ground under his feet. By the time dawn crept in and painted the office windows in pale light, Cash had made a decision, one that scared him more than any threat from a rival club ever had, because it meant giving up control and stepping into uncertainty. He would try again, not with pressure or manipulation, but with honesty, even if it meant hearing her tell him to walk away for good. He owed her that much. He didn't sleep after the sun came up. He showered, pulled on clean clothes, and rode out with the steady intention of a man who knew exactly where he was going, even if he didn't know how it would end. He waited outside her building until he saw her leave, watched her walk toward her car with the kind of purpose that had always impressed him. When she noticed him standing there, the surprise on her face cut deep before it hardened into guarded resolve.
"What are you doing here, Marcus?"
she asked. "I need 5 minutes," he said, not moving toward her, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "To say what I should have said before you walked out. After that, if you want me gone, I'm gone. You have my word." She studied him for a moment, then crossed her arms.
5 minutes.
"I was wrong to use leverage against you. Wrong to think that controlling the situation was the same as protecting you." And his voice stayed even, though it cost him. "I'd already given you my heart without knowing it. And when fear took over, I did what I always do. I tried to manage the outcome instead of trusting you. You're smarter than that, and stronger than that, and you deserved better from me." She said nothing, her expression unreadable. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm not promising I'll be perfect, because we both know that's not a number I can back up." He met her eyes. "But I love you, and I'm willing to walk away if staying means hurting you again. That choice belongs to you." The silence stretched long enough that Cash felt it in his bones, a waiting that reminded him of the moments before violence broke out, except this time there was no adrenaline to steady him.
"I don't know if I can trust you again."
Savannah finally said, her voice quiet and measured.
"What you did made me question your intentions and my own judgment. Rebuilding anything would take time, Cash. Time I'm not sure I have."
"I know," he said. "I earned every bit of that doubt." She nodded once, something shifting slightly in her expression, then turned and walked to her car without another word. He let her go. Every instinct screamed to chase her and fight harder, but he held his ground, because pushing now would only prove he hadn't learned a thing. The ride back to the compound felt heavier than the ride out, but there was a strange clarity in it too, a sense that whatever came next would be built on something real, or not at all. The days that followed were quieter in a different way, the raw edge of loss dulled by a fragile sense of resolve. Cash worked with a focus that felt steadier than before, as if admitting the truth had freed up space in his mind. He tightened protocols, closed gaps in the books, quietly rerouted funds to reinforce the club's fronts, because even heartbroken, he was still the treasurer, and the Blood Reapers still needed him sharp. Ryder checked in once, stopping in the doorway of the office without a word and giving Cash a single nod, the kind that acknowledged what it cost a man to keep moving forward when everything in him wanted to stop. It meant more than any pep talk could have. Late one evening, as the compound settled into a rare calm, Cash sat alone on the steps outside the clubhouse with a bottle he barely touched, watching the brothers laugh and argue nearby. Loving Savannah hadn't weakened him the way he'd once feared, even now, even like this. It had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd kept locked away for years. Whether or not she came back, he wouldn't be the same man he'd been before her. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a loss. When his phone buzzed close to midnight, he almost ignored it, assuming club business. But Savannah's name lit up the screen, and his breath caught hard enough to hurt. He grounded himself, then answered.
"I'm not ready to talk yet,"
she said.
"But I heard you. I just wanted you to know that."
"Okay," he said quietly. "That's enough." He sat with the phone long after she'd hung up, letting that small thread of connection anchor him. Sometimes survival wasn't about winning or losing, it was about holding on long enough to see what might still be possible. Chapter 17. Cash. Cash knew something was wrong the moment the numbers stopped behaving, because chaos had a signature. And this wasn't it. This was quiet and deliberate, the kind that slipped through audits and hid behind compliance reports like it belonged there. He sat in his office long before dawn, coffee untouched, eyes locked on a spread of quarterly statements pulled from 3 different fronts, all legitimate on paper, all clean enough to pass a cursory glance, yet together forming a pattern that made his jaw tighten. Revenue dips appeared where growth should have been steady, expenses inflated just enough to look like market fluctuation, and cash reserves that should have been insulated were bleeding through perfectly legal channels. This wasn't a smash and grab, it was a scalpel, and whoever wielded it understood the system well enough to turn it against them. He traced the movement back through shell vendors and service contracts, peeling layers with the patience of a man who had built empires out of margins and percentages, and the name surfaced again and again, a logistics consultancy that had started sniffing around their trucking routes under the guise of efficiency optimization. Cash pulled corporate filings, cross-referenced board members, and felt a cold certainty settle in his chest as familiar aliases surfaced in the metadata. Men tied to the Mercer Consortium through marriages and old business dissolutions that never really dissolved at all. They weren't attacking the club head-on because they didn't need to. They were poisoning the wells, using regulations and lawsuits and compliance traps to squeeze the blood reapers where it hurt most, in the daylight where violence couldn't touch them without consequences. By the time the sun broke over the compound, Cash had a working theory and a list of vulnerabilities that made his stomach knot, because this wasn't just about money, it was about exposure. If the consortium forced audits through stacked regulators or triggered loan covenants by manipulating ratios, they could freeze assets, ground trucks, and bleed the club dry while staying technically within the law. He called Ryder first, because this was a president-level threat, and when Ryder arrived with Cole and Jax in tow, Cash laid it out without embellishment. Every sentence is measured and sharp. He explained how legal fronts were being leveraged, how contracts could be weaponized, and how quickly it could spiral if they didn't move now, not with guns, but with paperwork and pressure. Ryder listened in silence, arms crossed, eyes hard, absorbing the reality that this war wouldn't be fought in alleys or clubhouses, but in courtrooms and compliance offices where the wrong move could end them faster than any rival ever had. Cole swore under his breath, pacing, already thinking in terms of retaliation, while Jax leaned against the wall with a predator's stillness, asking who needed to disappear to make it stop. Cash shook his head because this time, brute force would only make things worse. It would draw attention and accelerate the very scrutiny the Outlaws and their corporate backers were counting on. They needed countermeasures that looked as clean as the attack, solutions that neutralized risk without confirming suspicion, and that meant time, money, and expertise they couldn't source through usual channels. "There's something else," Cash said. He briefed them on what Ghost had uncovered. Elaine Marsh, the consulting retainer. For months, she's been funneling Savannah's work to the Mercer Consortium without her knowledge, chapter by chapter, as the audit progressed. Ryder's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went colder. "They used the auditor's own firm against us." "Against both of us," Cash said. "Savannah didn't know. Everything she documented in good faith got handed to the people now trying to hollow us out." He paused. "That's how they had a blueprint of our weak points. They didn't guess, they were given a map." "Can we use it?" Ryder asked. "If we can prove a licensed compliance professional was on the consortium's payroll while her firm was conducting regulatory audits, that invalidates any finding they try to weaponize against us and opens a formal investigation into the consortium's interference with regulatory processes." He looked around the table. "They turned the system against us. We use that same system to expose them." The room was quiet for a moment, each man absorbing the shift from defense to counteroffense. Cash hated how quickly his thoughts went to Savannah after that, not because she was a solution to be used, but because she was the one person who could see this battlefield as clearly as he did and move through it without leaving fingerprints. He didn't say her name out loud in that meeting, not yet, because he wasn't sure if he had the right to pull her back into this world, especially after everything he'd put her through. But the truth pressed in on him anyway. He outlined immediate steps, freezing certain contracts, accelerating others, quietly restructuring debt to create buffers, and initiating internal audits before any external body could force their hand. Ryder approved the moves without hesitation, trusting him to steer them through the minefield, and as the meeting broke, The weight of that trust settled heavier than ever on his shoulders. The rest of the day blurred into calls and calculations. Cash coordinated with accountants who didn't know who they really worked for, lawyers who specialized in aggressive compliance defense, and vendors who owed favors they didn't remember earning. He moved money like water, redirecting flows to shore up weak points, even as he tracked the consortium's progress through public filings and whispered rumors that confirmed his fears. They were patient, disciplined, and smart, which made them dangerous in a way he respected, even as he prepared to dismantle them. By nightfall, he had a clearer picture of the trap and a narrower window to escape it. Both hinged on information the consortium believed they controlled. Alone again in his office, Cash leaned back and closed his eyes, the hum of servers filling the space Savannah once occupied. And for a moment, he let himself imagine calling her, explaining the full scope of the threat. The consortium, the Elaine connection, everything, and ask for help he wasn't sure she'd give. He hated that the club's survival might depend on reopening wounds that hadn't healed, hated that his heart and his duty were colliding again, but the Ledger didn't care about feelings, only outcomes. If the consortium succeeded, there would be nothing left for him to protect, no future to rebuild, and that truth forced a decision he'd been circling since she left. He opened his phone and drafted a message he rewrote 3 times, keeping it factual and restrained, explaining the financial threat and the Elaine discovery without drama. Making it clear he wasn't asking her to compromise herself, only to look at something he couldn't trust anyone else to see clearly, and to know the truth about what her own supervisor had done before she went back to that firm. He stared at the screen for a long time before sending it, aware that this might push her further away or pull her back into a world she was trying to escape. And when the message finally went through, he felt the familiar mix of relief and dread settle in his gut. Cash didn't wait by the phone like a hopeful fool, but he didn't put it down either, keeping it within reach as he worked through contingencies that grew darker the deeper he went. The consortium had threaded its influence through arbitration clauses and service-level agreements that could trigger penalties without ever filing a lawsuit. He countered by drafting parallel exits that would look like routine restructuring to any outsider. He prepared shadow ledgers that mirrored the official books, not to hide wrongdoing, but to stress-test outcomes, mapping which fronts could absorb losses and which would collapse if the pressure tightened. It was a chess match played at the speed of bureaucracy, and Cash hated that every move required restraint instead of force. By the time night settled over the compound, Ryder called him back into church, the long table crowded with officers who understood the stakes, even if they didn't live in the numbers the way Cash did. He briefed them again, tighter this time, focusing on what each man needed to know without inviting panic, because fear traveled fast and made sloppy decisions. Zane asked about rerouting shipments, Cole pushed for aggressive buyouts to starve the shell vendors, and Jax offered to encourage a consultant to lose interest. But Cash held the line, reminding them that visible interference would only validate the narrative their rivals were building. They needed patience, precision, and a plan that turned compliance into a weapon. And when Ryder backed him without hesitation, he felt the quiet reinforcement of command that steadied his resolve. After church, the compound slipped into its usual rhythm, engines revving and laughter carrying across the yard. But Cash stayed behind, anchored to his desk by the glow of monitors and the steady pulse of data flowing in. He initiated a forensic review of transaction timing, hunting for patterns that could establish intent rather than coincidence, because intent was what regulators and courts cared about when it came time to assign blame. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that the consortium had overreached, leaving faint fingerprints in the rush to tighten the noose, and Cash cataloged each one with meticulous care. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about building a case that would survive daylight and scrutiny. His phone buzzed close to midnight, and this time he didn't hesitate, his thumb opening the message before doubt could creep in. Savannah's reply was measured and cautious, asking for a high-level summary and assurances that she wouldn't be pulled into anything illegal or retaliatory. Cash felt a quiet gratitude that she hadn't dismissed him outright. She hadn't mentioned Elaine yet, and he didn't push. That wound needed its own time to land. He answered with the same restraint, outlining the threat in clean terms, emphasizing that it operated through lawful channels and that her role, if she chose to look, would be advisory and independent. He promised transparency and boundaries, not as leverage, but as a line he wouldn't cross again. and when he sent the message, he exhaled slowly, aware that trust was rebuilt one careful sentence at a time. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by calculations and the echo of Savannah's voice in his head, and when morning arrived, he was already moving, coordinating with counsel to prepare preemptive disclosures that would blunt any surprise audits, even though they just had one done. He authorized a temporary slowdown on certain routes, absorbing short-term pain to avoid catastrophic exposure, and redirected liquidity to insulate payroll and critical vendors, because the club's people came first. The consortium wanted to make them look unstable, and Cash intended to present the opposite, a picture of disciplined adjustment that would frustrate anyone hunting for weakness. By afternoon, Savannah responded again, agreeing to review anonymized documents. Her conditions were clear and non-negotiable. Cash accepted them without comment, sending over sanitized data that still told the story if you knew how to read it. He didn't ask when she could meet or push for more, trusting that she would engage on her terms if she saw what he saw, and that trust felt like a small victory in itself. As he waited, he continued building the counteroffensive, lining up compliance audits of the consortium's suspected fronts through channels that would appear routine, setting the stage for scrutiny to flow both ways. The day ended with Cash standing on the edge of the yard, watching the sun sink behind rows of bikes, the weight of responsibility pressing in but no longer crushing. He understood now that this fight would test more than his skill with numbers. It would test his ability to lead and to accept help without turning it into a transaction. Whatever Savannah decided, he would face the consequences of his choices head-on because the ledger of his life demanded it. As night settled and the compound lights flickered on, Cash turned back toward the office, ready to keep fighting a war that didn't leave bruises, only balance sheets and scars you couldn't see, determined to ensure the Blood Reapers survived what the consortium and their outlaw enforcers had started. Chapter 18. Cash. Cash stopped pretending he was fine the night the numbers finally balanced, and he still felt empty. The victory was hollow in a way that made his chest ache worse than the loss had. The Outlaws' pressure was temporarily contained, buffers in place and regulators appeased, but Savannah's absence left a silence he couldn't drown out with work anymore, and the compound felt louder because of it. Every laugh and engine rev a reminder that life kept moving whether he was ready or not. He rode hard into the city, throttle wide and thoughts reckless, letting the cold air bite his skin as if pain might ground him in something real. Because control without purpose had turned into a cage he didn't know how to escape. The bar he ended up in was dim and crowded, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and nobody cared who you were, as long as you paid and kept your hands to yourself until invited otherwise. Cash drank more than he should have, letting the burn settle deep, watching bodies move and collide under flickering lights, the pulse of music vibrating through him until it blurred the edges of thought. A woman approached him without hesitation, bold and unafraid, sliding onto the stool beside him like she owned it. Dark eyes, red mouth, the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what she wanted.
You look like a man who needs a drink he didn't pour himself,
she said, nodding at his glass. Already got one.
Then you need company.
She didn't ask it. She stated it, tilting her head with a smile that held no pretense. Cash looked at her for a long moment. I'm not good company tonight.
I'm not looking for good.
Her eyes were sharp with interest and zero illusions.
So we understand each other.
He stared at her, then nodded once. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. This wasn't about connection or tenderness. It was about friction and release, about silencing the noise in his head for a few stolen hours. The room upstairs smelled like whiskey and cheap perfume, and the second the door shut behind them, whatever restraint he had left went with it. He had her backed against the wall before she finished turning around, one hand fisting in her hair to pull her head back, the other gripping her hip hard enough to bruise. She didn't flinch. She laughed low in her throat and grabbed the front of his cut, pulling him closer.
There he is,
she murmured. Cash didn't answer. He took her mouth instead, rough and without apology, and she gave it back just as hard. Clothes came off without ceremony. His shirt yanked over his head, her dress unzipped and dropped, no slow reveal, no patience for any of it. He turned her around, pressed her chest to the wall, and used his knee to push her stance wider, his hands mapping the curve of her waist and hips with a grip that was more possession than tenderness. She arched back into him with a sharp breath, fingers splayed against the plaster.
Don't go easy on me.
He didn't. Their movements were rough and urgent, driven by a hunger that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with forgetting. The kind of raw, relentless rhythm that demanded nothing beyond the present moment, that left no room for thought or memory or the ghost of a woman with steel in her spine and a calculator on her desk. Cash drove deep and hard, his jaw set, one hand braced against the wall beside her head and the other wrapped in her hair, keeping her exactly where he wanted her. She took everything he gave and pushed back for more, and for a few brutal, blinding minutes, the noise stopped. Then it was over. The silence pressed in harder than before. He stepped back and she turned, straightening up with the calm ease of a woman who'd never expected more than this. She dressed without ceremony afterwards. When she got to the door, she paused and gave him a knowing look that carried no judgment.
You good?
Yeah, he said. It was the only lie he told her all night. She left without asking his name. Cash appreciated that more than he expected, because it meant this moment would stay exactly what it was. Meaningless. He rode back to the compound before dawn, the city lights fading behind him as guilt crept in alongside regret, not because he'd betrayed anyone, but because he'd betrayed himself by pretending this was the kind of man he wanted to be. Violence and sex had always been easy distractions, tools he knew how to use, but without Savannah, they felt blunt and ineffective. Unable to reach the deeper wound he'd been avoiding, he parked his bike and sat there longer than necessary, helmet in his hands, admitting to himself that this spiral wouldn't end until he faced the truth he'd been circling since she left. By the time he made it back to his office, the club was waking up, and he forced himself into routine, showering away the smell of the night and pulling on clean clothes like armor. He reviewed reports and answered calls, his voice steady and detached. Professionalism was another mask he wore well, but beneath it, the emptiness lingered. Ryder caught him in the hallway mid-morning, falling into step beside him without preamble. You look like hell. I'm fine. You've been fine for 2 weeks. Ryder's voice was even, but the weight behind it wasn't. That word's starting to mean something different every time you say it. Cash stopped walking. What do you want me to tell you, Ryder? The truth would be a start. The truth is, the books are clean, the outlaws are quiet for now, and I'm handling it. He met Ryder's eyes. That's all that matters right now. Ryder studied him for a long moment. You ride out alone again last night. Cash said nothing. I'm not your keeper. Ryder's jaw tightened. But I need my treasurer present, not just breathing. He held Cash's gaze a beat longer, then walked away without waiting for a response. Cash stood there after he left, the hallway suddenly too quiet, Ryder's words settling somewhere under his ribs where the rest of the damage already lived. When his phone buzzed mid-morning with a message from Savannah, it was brief, focusing on the documents he'd sent. Cash felt something shift, a tightening and loosening all at once, because even in her restraint there was engagement, a sign she hadn't closed the door completely. He read her words carefully, responding with the same measured tone, grateful for the lifeline even as he recognized how fragile it was. The night before felt like a failure in comparison, a reminder that nothing short of honesty and patience would bring him back to solid ground. Cash tried to convince himself the night before had burned something out of his system, that the rough, empty release had scraped him clean enough to function, but the truth was uglier and harder to ignore. The edge inside him hadn't dulled. It had sharpened, turned inward, and as the day wore on, he found himself restless in ways that work couldn't touch. He moved through the compound with a detached intensity, nodding to brothers and answering questions on autopilot, his mind drifting back to the bar and to the way it had almost worked for a few minutes before the hollowness came roaring back. He knew this pattern, recognized it from darker stretches of his past. The familiarity made his jaw tighten because he'd promised himself he wouldn't slide that far again. That night, the club threw a party that felt louder and wilder than usual, or maybe Cash just noticed it more. The music thudding through the walls, bodies pressed close in a blur of skin and laughter, whiskey flowing freely without pretense. The air crackled with the kind of reckless energy that came from living too close to the edge for too long. Cash drank with them, not to celebrate but to numb, watching the chaos from the periphery. A club girl found him leaning against the wall near the back of the clubhouse, dark hair loose, a shot glass dangling from her fingers, and wearing the kind of smile that made clear she had no interest in small talk.
You've been standing there all night.
She said, looking him over without apology.
watching everybody else like you're deciding whether they deserve to be here.
Maybe I am.
Or maybe
She stepped into his space, tipping her chin up.
you're waiting for someone to give you a reason to stop thinking.
Cash looked down at her. You volunteering? She took his hand and pressed it flat against her hip.
I've been volunteering for 20 minutes. You've just been too far in your head to notice.
He wasn't far in his head after that. He pulled her into the back hallway, away from the noise, and what started against the wall moved quickly to a borrowed room. The party was muffled and distant on the other side. This time was different from the bar, more raw, fueled by frustration and the particular violence of a man at war with himself. He stripped her down with rough efficiency, his hands pulling and gripping without ceremony, and she gave back as good as she got. Nails raking down his chest, teeth at his jaw, a breathless curse when he flipped her onto her stomach and pinned both her wrists behind her back with one hand.
Don't stop.
She said into the pillow. He didn't. He wound a fist in her hair, pulled her back against him, and drove into her hard enough to make the bunk frame crack against the wall. There was no gentleness in it, and neither of them wanted any. Just heat and pressure and the sharp, punishing rhythm of two people using each other for something they both understood. She was loud and unashamed about it, and Cash used that, pushed harder when she gasped, held her exactly where he needed her, taking back control in the only way that felt available to him tonight. When it was over, he felt the same familiar drop. The emptiness rushed back in with a vengeance that left him staring at the ceiling, chest heaving, the noise in his head already reassembling itself. He left without cruelty, but without tenderness either. Tenderness belonged to a woman who wasn't his to touch anymore, and the thought stung worse than any regret. The night air outside was cool against his skin, sobering him faster than he wanted, and as he walked away, he understood with brutal clarity that this spiral wasn't about sex at all. It was about punishing himself for failing the one person who'd mattered enough to crack his armor. He hated that awareness, hated that even at his worst, Savannah was still the measure he held himself against. Back in his office, he poured a drink but didn't touch it, letting it sit on the desk like an accusation as he stared at the glowing screens in front of him. Messages from Savannah waited, professional and distant, focused only on numbers and the threat they represented. He latched onto them with a discipline born of necessity, responding carefully, sticking to facts and analysis, grateful for the structure her questions brought because it forced him back into the part of himself that functioned best under pressure. You flagged the variance in the Eastern Front account, she'd written. Is that a bleed or a buffer you're building? Buffer, he typed back. 3 layers. Should hold through the quarter if the Outlaws don't push sooner than projected. A pause, then. They'll push sooner. Build a 4th. Despite everything, the corner of his mouth moved. Already on it. As they exchanged messages, something steadier settled in his chest, a reminder that chaos wasn't the only way to cope, even if it was the easiest. By the time the compound quieted and the party burned itself out, Cash was alone again, but the solitude felt different this time, less like a void and more like a reckoning. He admitted to himself that this path, the debauchery, the recklessness, and the numbing wasn't strength, it was avoidance, and if he kept going, he'd lose whatever chance he had left to rebuild something real with Savannah. The realization didn't come with peace, it came with resolve, thin and hard-earned, the kind that demanded better choices even when they hurt. He shut down the office lights and stepped outside. The night sky stretched wide and indifferent above him. He took a breath that felt like the first honest one in days, grounding himself in the knowledge that this low point didn't have to define him. Marcus Cash Bennett had survived worse than heartbreak and self-destruction. He'd survived men who wanted him dead and systems designed to swallow him whole. He could survive this too, but only if he stopped trying to fight it with his fists and his body and started sitting with it instead. As he headed toward his quarters, he made himself a promise, one he intended to keep. Face what comes next with clarity, not chaos, even if it means sitting with the pain instead of trying to fuck or fight it away, especially then.
Chapter 19, Savannah. Savannah stared at the city skyline from her apartment window and tried to convince herself that distance was the same thing as safety. But the lie had worn thin days ago, peeling away every time she opened another spreadsheet or reread Marcus's messages with a precision that felt uncomfortably intimate. The numbers he'd sent her didn't scream corruption on their own, not in the crude, obvious way she'd once expected from an outlaw motorcycle club, but taken together, they formed a web of pressure points that told a far more dangerous story. One of strategic manipulation and regulatory warfare that made her pulse quicken, despite herself. She hated that part of her, admired the complexity of it, hated even more that she understood exactly why Marcus had reached out. Because this wasn't a problem brute force could solve, and they both knew it. She told herself she was reviewing the documents as a professional courtesy, a final loose end to tie off before she walked away for good. But every hour she spent tracing transactions pulled her deeper into the fight she'd sworn to leave behind. Savannah saw the Outlaws' hand in the timing of contract amendments and the clustering of compliance risks, patterns subtle enough to evade most auditors, but glaring to someone trained to look for intent beneath the surface. The realization settled heavy in her chest because it meant Marcus hadn't exaggerated the threat, and the Blood Reapers were standing on the edge of a legal cliff that could drag a lot of innocent people down with them. She thought about the clerks and drivers she'd met, the quiet pride in their work, and the line between personal and professional blurred further. Savannah typed out a dozen messages before deleting them, each one wrestling with the same truth she didn't want to face. Walking away now might protect her career, but it wouldn't protect her conscience. She'd built her life on principles, on doing things the right way even when it was harder, and ignoring this felt like a betrayal of that foundation, no matter how complicated her history with Marcus had become. She remembered the way he'd stood in front of her building and owned his mistakes without excuses. That memory softened something inside her, not enough to erase the hurt, but enough to let honesty back into the conversation she'd been avoiding. When she finally called him, her hand shook just enough to annoy her because she refused to let emotion dictate this decision, even if it influenced it. He answered on the second ring.
Savannah.
Just her name. No pressure in it, no relief, just the careful steadiness of a man braced for whatever came next. "I've been through everything you sent," she said, keeping her voice even. "This isn't just financial harassment. The Outlaws are exploiting regulatory mechanisms deliberately, timing amendments to cluster compliance risks, forcing a pressure cascade that's designed to look organic. Most auditors would miss it." A beat of silence.
You saw all that.
"I see patterns, Marcus. It's what you paid me for." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend I called just to tell you that."
Don't you think it's time you start calling me Cash?
He said. "What?" she replied.
Cash, that's my road name.
He said.
No one calls me Marcus except for you.
I didn't reply immediately. "I prefer to use Marcus." I said final. He blew out a breath and said,
Fine. Why did you call then, if not just to tell me about your findings?
She exhaled. "Because I can't look at this and walk away. I want that on record before we go any further. I have conditions."
Name them.
"I won't falsify records. I won't hide crimes. I won't manufacture anything. And I won't put my license on the line for a strategy that can't survive daylight. What I'll do is build a defense using the truth, exposure, documentation, and legitimate channels. If that's not enough, then I'm not your solution."
It's enough.
He said without hesitation.
Those are your terms. I accept them.
The absence of negotiation caught her off guard more than she wanted to admit. She'd expected pushback, a counteroffer, some attempt to carve out room for flexibility. That he didn't try sent a ripple of something dangerously close to relief through her chest. "All right," she said. "Then let me tell you what I found." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation slipping into familiar territory as they dissected the problem together, their minds aligning in a way that felt achingly natural, despite the emotional distance she'd tried to maintain. Savannah outlined preliminary ideas for isolating the Outlaws' shell entities and triggering reciprocal audits through legitimate channels, strategies that would force transparency where their rivals least wanted it. Marcus listened intently, asking questions that sharpened her thinking without challenging her integrity. And for the first time since she'd left, Savannah felt like they were standing on the same side of something again, not as lovers, but but as equals, fighting a common threat. After the call ended, she sank back into her chair and closed her eyes, aware that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, not legally, but emotionally. Helping Marcus and the club meant stepping back into a world that had already upended her life once, and the fear of being hurt again coiled tight in her stomach. But alongside it was a quieter certainty, the knowledge that this was the right thing to do, not for him alone, but for herself, because running from complexity had never been her style. As she reopened the files and began mapping out a more comprehensive plan, Savannah accepted that staying away had never truly been an option, not when the truth demanded her attention and her heart refused to stay silent. She worked late into the night, the quiet of her apartment broken only by the soft tap of keys and the low hum of the city beyond the glass. With every connection she traced, the shape of the Outlaws' scheme became clearer. They weren't just siphoning pressure into the Blood Reapers' fronts, they were creating a paper storm designed to force a reaction, counting on panic to produce mistakes that regulators could seize on. Savannah mapped timelines and dependencies, annotating where compliance triggers overlapped with liquidity constraints. And as the model sharpened, she saw the opening they'd left behind, a narrow corridor of truth that could turn scrutiny back on its source. It wasn't flashy or fast, but it was clean, the kind of solution that held up because it didn't cheat. She sent Marcus a concise summary just before midnight. His response came within minutes. Thorough. Call at 8? She appreciated the restraint, the way he didn't push or praise or try to pull her closer than she was ready to be. 8 works, she wrote back. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by flashes of numbers and memories she didn't invite. And when morning arrived, Savannah brewed coffee and grounded herself in routine before dialing Marcus. The vendor chain is the cleanest entry point, she said when he picked up, skipping pleasantries. Specifically the subcontractors on the Eastern distribution side. There are existing statutes that compel beneficial ownership disclosure under audit conditions. If we file correctly, we don't need to allege anything. The Outlaws' own documentation will do the work.
And if they catch on and try to restructure before the audit window opens?
That's actually better for us. Any restructuring at this stage creates a paper trail that looks like obstruction. Either way, they lose ground. She pulled up the annotated timeline on her screen. But the window is narrow, 10 days before they see it coming.
Then we move in 10 days.
A pause.
This strategy is airtight, Savannah.
It's defensible, she corrected. Airtight is what it becomes if everyone holds the line and doesn't get impatient. She made sure he heard the emphasis. That means the club, too.
I'll handle the club,
Marcus said.
You have my word.
They refined the plan for another 40 minutes, assigning tasks and timelines with an ease that reminded her why they'd been so dangerous together when everything went wrong. She flagged a specific vendor chain that could be compelled to disclose beneficial ownership under existing statutes, creating a domino effect that would expose the Outlaws' influence without a single fabricated entry. Marcus listened and adapted, integrating her strategy into the club's broader defense. The collaboration felt less like a compromise and more like a correction, a return to alignment after a long detour. As the hours passed, Savannah felt a cautious confidence settle in, not just in the plan, but in herself, because she was choosing this path with clear eyes. She wasn't doing it to win Marcus back or to prove anything to anyone. She was doing it because the truth deserved a chance to stand on its own. Still, the emotional undercurrent was impossible to ignore. The awareness that working this closely with him reopened doors she'd slammed shut to protect herself. She acknowledged the risk without letting it dictate her decisions, reminding herself that boundaries were not walls, but lines she could redraw as circumstances changed. By late afternoon, she finalized a memorandum that framed the issue in neutral language, ready for council review, and sent it off with a note reiterating her conditions and availability. His reply came quickly. "Thank you. I know what it cost you to make that call." Savannah stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Don't make me regret it." "I won't," he wrote. She closed the thread and got back to work. The fear was still there, sharp and honest, but it no longer owned her, balanced by a steadier resolve and a sense of purpose that had been missing since she'd walked away. Savannah didn't know what this would mean for her future or for whatever remained between her and Marcus, but she knew this much was true. She wouldn't hide from the work or the consequences. As the day gave way to evening, she picked up her phone and sent one last message, confirming next steps and timelines, then set it aside, ready to face what came next with clarity instead of doubt.
Chapter 20. Cash. Cash knew the moment Savannah agreed to meet him in person, whatever they'd been carefully holding apart over calls and messages was about to collide head-on. The anticipation sat in his chest like a live wire as he waited in the quiet conference room of one of the club's legitimate offices downtown. The space was neutral by design, glass and steel and professionalism, far removed from the compound and the weight of history that lived there. But it didn't stop memories from bleeding in, especially when he imagined her walking through the door with that composed stride that always masked how deeply she felt things. He told himself this meeting was about the Outlaws, about strategy and timing, but his body didn't believe the lie, tightening with a need he hadn't been able to bury no matter how hard he tried. When Savannah arrived, the air shifted instantly. The room was suddenly too small for everything that went unsaid between them, and Cash had to consciously rein in the instinct to close the distance the second their eyes met. She looked the same and different all at once. Sharper somehow, guarded but still unmistakably her, and when she greeted him with a professional nod instead of a hug or a smile, it landed harder than he expected. They sat across from each other at the table, laptops open, papers spread out, and for the first few minutes it was all business, voices steady as they walked through timelines and exposure points, their minds syncing the way they always had when the stakes were high. The tension built in the pauses, in the way her fingers tapped the table when she was thinking, and in the way Cash caught himself watching her mouth when she spoke, instead of the data on the screen. When she pointed out a vulnerability he'd missed, her shoulder brushed his as she leaned closer. The contact was brief but electric, sending a jolt through him that made it clear just how thin the line was between control and collapse. Savannah straightened immediately, a flicker of frustration crossing her face, as if she was angry at herself for reacting. Cash swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his voice even as he acknowledged her point and adjusted the plan. It was Savannah who finally broke, not with words at first, but with a sharp exhale and a look that stripped away the professional mask she'd been clinging to, her eyes dark with the same conflict tearing through him.
"You're making it impossible to keep this compartmentalized,"
she said, her voice tight.
"You just stand there and remind me of everything I lost when I walked away."
"I'm not trying to do that," Cash said. "I'm not here to pull you back with proximity or guilt. I know what you said about boundaries, and I meant it when I told you I respected them." He held her gaze. "But pretending there's nothing between us is just another lie, and I don't think either of us is strong enough to keep telling it." The argument that followed was low and intense, voices tight with emotion, anger and longing tangling until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began.
"You still want control,"
Savannah said, the words sharp and deliberate.
"You drew me back into your orbit because it serves the club and your pride. Admit that."
No. The word came out harder than he intended. Cash pulled in a breath and steadied himself. "I want you because you challenge me. Because you see me clearly, all of it, and you didn't look away. Because losing you stripped me down to something I didn't know was in there." He let that sit. "That's the truth I've been carrying for weeks." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. When Savannah stepped closer, it wasn't tentative but decisive, driven by frustration and a need that had been building since the day she left. Cash met her halfway without thinking, hands bracketing her hips as their mouths collided in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was heated and messy, teeth and breath and the taste of restraint finally giving way, months of tension pouring out in a rush that left them both unsteady. Savannah shoved him back against the table, the edge digging into his lower back as her hands fisted in his shirt, and Cash let her, welcomed the anger in it because it matched the fire burning through him. They broke apart only long enough to breathe, foreheads pressed together, the room spinning slightly as reality crept back in around the edges.
"I hate you for making me feel this much,"
she whispered. "I hate myself for the same reason," he said. Walking away didn't make it hurt any less for me either. His hands tightened on her hips, grounding her there, waiting for her to push him away or pull him closer. When she did neither, just stared at him with eyes full of anger and need, he understood that this reunion was going to change everything, whether they were ready for it or not. Cash slowed it down before it could tip into something reckless, resting his forehead against Savannah's and forcing himself to breathe until the rush settled into something steadier, something that felt like choice instead of impulse. "We can stop," he said quietly. "Right now. Whatever this is doesn't have to be decided in the heat of a moment." Savannah searched his face like she was looking for cracks in the promise. When she found none, the tension in her shoulders eased just enough for honesty to slip through.
"I'm angry,"
she said.
"because walking away didn't make me stop wanting you. Every night I told myself distance was clarity, and then I'd hear your voice in my head the second everything went quiet."
Cash kept his hands open at her sides, grounding but not claiming. "I want you," he said, "but not at the cost of your autonomy or my integrity. I don't need this to be easy or immediate. I just need it to be real." The room felt different after that, charged but calmer, like a storm that had chosen to rain instead of tear everything apart. Savannah closed the distance again, slower this time, her mouth brushing his with a deliberate softness that rewrote the kiss into something deeper and more intentional. Cash responded in kind, the heat still there but tempered by care, hands tracing familiar lines with a reverence that surprised him. They didn't rush or pretend the past weeks hadn't carved space between them, and when her fingers slid into his hair and she breathed his name like a confession, the sound anchored him in a way nothing else had managed to do since she left. They moved together without spectacle, the conference room falling away as the world narrowed to breath and closeness, the steady rhythm of reconnecting after too much silence. It wasn't about proving anything or taking control, but about meeting in the middle, acknowledging the anger and longing without letting either one lead. When they finally pulled apart, the quiet that settled felt earned, the kind that followed truth instead of avoidance. And Cash knew this moment mattered, because it didn't erase the work ahead. It committed them to it. Savannah straightened, smoothing her jacket and reclaiming the professional distance she needed to feel safe, and Cash respected it, giving her the space without retreating emotionally. They returned to the table, not as if nothing had happened, but as if what had happened had clarified the stakes, and the plan took shape with renewed focus. They assigned tasks and timelines, voices steady, eyes meeting with an understanding that went beyond the numbers, because whatever came next would test them both. When the meeting ended, they stood by the door, neither rushing to leave, the air between them still warm with possibility.
"This doesn't fix everything,"
Savannah said.
"Trust takes time. It takes consistency."
"I know," Cash said. "I'm not asking you to hand it over. I'm asking you to watch what I do with it." She nodded once, a small gesture heavy with meaning, and when she left, he watched her go with a steadiness he hadn't felt in weeks, because for the first time since she'd walked away, the path forward felt uncertain but honest, and that was enough.
Chapter 21. Savannah. The meeting at the downtown office had ended 3 days ago, but the memory of it hadn't. Savannah had told herself that was normal, that the kiss and everything after it had simply stirred up emotions she hadn't finished processing, and that by the time she pulled up to the compound gates, she would have sorted herself out enough to be useful. She hadn't sorted herself out, but she was here anyway, which probably said everything she wasn't ready to say out loud. The Blood Reapers clubhouse looked the same as the day she left, solid and unapologetic against the skyline. Yet everything felt sharper now, more defined, as if distance had stripped away the haze of first impressions and left only truth. Engines rumbled somewhere to her right, laughter carried on the wind, and she felt eyes on her the moment she stepped out of the car. Assessing but not hostile, curious rather than judgmental. She lifted her chin and walked forward, refusing to let doubt dictate her pace. Ryder met her at the entrance, his presence steady and grounded.
"Glad you came back,"
he said, and there was nothing performative in it. No ceremony, no pressure, just one straight-talking man acknowledging a decision he understood had cost her something.
"We needed the best and you're it. That matters to this club."
"Let's make sure it counts for something," Savannah replied. The corner of his mouth moved just enough to qualify as approval, and he stepped aside to let her in. Inside, the familiar scent of oil, leather, and wood wrapped around her, bringing back flashes of late nights with spreadsheets and arguments that had turned into something far more dangerous. She pushed those thoughts aside only halfway as she followed Ryder toward the office, where Marcus waited, because the other half of her had already stopped pretending she felt nothing. Marcus stood when she entered, the movement automatic and restrained. Their eyes met and held a beat longer than strictly necessary, long enough that she felt it somewhere behind her sternum before professionalism reclaimed the room. He didn't close the distance or reach for her, and that deliberate restraint did something unexpected. It steadied her. He'd heard her when she said trust would take time, and he was showing her rather than telling her, which had always been the harder thing to fake. They sat across from each other, Ryder taking a position near the door, and Savannah opened her laptop with deliberate calm, projecting the findings she'd refined overnight. The Outlaws' shell entities formed a clear network now, the threads unmistakable when viewed together, and she walked them through the timeline that would allow reciprocal audits to trigger without appearing retaliatory. Marcus listened with the focus of a man who understood both the stakes and the opportunity, asking pointed questions that sharpened the edges of the plan without undermining it. Savannah outlined the necessity of third-party compliance consultants, independent verification, and proactive disclosures that would position the club as transparent rather than defensive. Ryder absorbed every word, his expression unreadable but intent, and when she finished, he nodded once and said they'd move forward exactly as she recommended. The absence of argument or ego reassured her more than any promise could have. The meeting stretched into early afternoon as they divided responsibilities and established timelines, the room humming with quiet urgency. Savannah felt herself slip into rhythm beside Marcus, the way she always had, their collaboration efficient and intuitive, except now she wasn't pretending not to notice it. The friction that had once sparked conflict was channeling into something productive, and there was a comfort in that she hadn't expected to feel this soon. There were moments when their hands brushed over shared documents or their eyes met across the table, and each time a current passed between them that neither of them acknowledged aloud. But this time she didn't look away quite as fast. When the formal discussion ended, Ryder excused himself, leaving Savannah and Marcus alone in the office with the low hum of the building settling around them. The silence wasn't hostile, but it was charged, heavy with everything they hadn't resolved. Savannah closed her laptop slowly, aware that leaving without acknowledging the undercurrent between them would feel dishonest after everything they'd said downtown. She wasn't ready for grand declarations, and she wasn't pretending the hurt had disappeared, but she also wasn't willing to hide behind professionalism the way she might have a week ago. Marcus broke the silence first.
I mean it when I say the club will honor every boundary you set.
He said, his voice steady and unadorned.
And I mean it personally. You being here isn't something I'll take for granted.
Savannah believed him, and the fact that she believed him without having to talk herself into it meant something she wasn't quite ready to name yet. She looked at him and didn't look away immediately. I know you mean that, she said quietly. That's why I'm here. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it wasn't armor either. She stood, the distance between them small but no longer feeling like a boundary so much as a pause, and as she moved toward the door, something in the air between them felt less like unfinished business and more like something just beginning. As she stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the compound felt different than it had that morning, less like a place she was trespassing in and more like a battlefield she had chosen to enter with clear intent. The road ahead would be complicated, filled with legal maneuvering and emotional landmines alike, but Savannah felt steadier than she had in weeks, grounded in the knowledge that she was here by choice. Whatever the Outlaws had set in motion, they would face it head-on, and this time, she wouldn't be standing alone. Savannah had just reached her car when the roar of an engine split the late afternoon air, not the familiar cadence of a reaper's bike. Different, aggressive, unwelcome. Her instincts sharpened instantly. She didn't turn her head right away. Instead, she scanned the reflection in her side mirror first. A black SUV slowing near the edge of the compound road. Tinted windows with no visible plates. The gate guards were already moving. Before she could step back toward the building, Marcus was there. She hadn't heard him approach. 1 second, she was alone with her thoughts. The next, his hand was at the small of her back, steady and firm.
Inside,
He said quietly. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was command layered with control. Savannah didn't argue. They moved quickly, but not chaotically. Ryder was already outside barking orders, 2 prospects shifting position to block the driveway. The SUV idled for a long beat that felt intentional, like someone inside was taking inventory. Then the driver's window rolled down. A man leaned halfway out, resting his arm against the door, like he didn't have a care in the world. Savannah felt Marcus go rigid beside her. She didn't need an introduction. Outlaw. The man smiled slowly and deliberately, tipping his chin in Marcus's direction.
no trouble.
He called casually.
Just passing through.
No one believed that. The SUV remained parked long enough to make the message clear before it finally rolled forward and disappeared down the road. Silence followed, the kind that pressed against your ears. Marcus didn't remove his hand from her back until the vehicle was completely out of sight. Even then, he didn't step away. They're testing you, Savannah said quietly.
Yeah,
Ryder muttered.
and they know you're here.
That landed heavier than the engine roar had. Savannah inhaled slowly, steadying herself. This wasn't a coincidence. The outlaws had wanted her to see them, to know she'd been noticed. Good. Let them notice. Inside the office again, the energy had shifted. What had been strategic now felt urgent. Marcus shut the door harder than necessary and turned toward her, jaw tight.
This changes things.
No, Savannah replied calmly. It clarifies things. Ryder folded his arms.
How so?
They're escalating without acting, which means they don't want a direct confrontation. Not yet. They want leverage, intimidation, disruption. Marcus studied her carefully.
You think this is about the audit plan?
I know it is. She moved to the whiteboard and began writing without hesitation, outlining next steps faster now, sharper. If they're watching the compound, they're watching me, which means we assume my communications are being monitored. We compartmentalize immediately. Ryder nodded once. Marcus didn't look convinced.
You're not pulling out.
He said flatly. It wasn't a question. Savannah turned to face him fully. No. The words settled between them like a gauntlet. You knew there'd be pushback, she continued. This is predictable behavior from men who think intimidation replaces strategy. His eyes darkened slightly at that.
They don't play clean.
Well, maybe I need to start playing dirty, she said evenly. Ryder huffed a quiet laugh at that, but didn't interrupt. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice.
This puts you in their line of sight.
I was already there, she answered. The difference now is I'm aware. The truth was, fear existed. She'd be lying to herself if it didn't. But it wasn't paralyzing. It was clarifying. She refused to let them shrink her world. After another hour of tightening communication protocols and restructuring timelines, Ryder left to coordinate external security. The door closed behind him, leaving Savannah and Marcus alone again. But this time, the silence felt different. Charged, raw.
You should stay here tonight.
Marcus said. That wasn't part of the plan.
Plans change.
She met his gaze. Are you asking because it's safer or because it's easier? His jaw flexed.
Both.
Honesty? She appreciated that more than she probably should have, and the warmth that moved through her chest wasn't something she tried to talk herself out of this time. Savannah stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating off him. If I stay, she said softly, it's not because I'm scared.
I know.
And it's not because you told me to. His voice dropped lower.
I know that too.
She studied him carefully. the restraint he was exercising, the control he was choosing instead of demanding. It mattered, more than she'd expected it to when the day started. "You don't get to protect me by shutting me out," she said gently, "but you can protect me by trusting me." That hit. She saw it in his eyes. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull back, and brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. A simple touch. Not possessive, not claiming, just careful.
"I do trust you,"
he said quietly.
"That's why this scares me."
Savannah didn't soften at that exactly, but something in her that had been braced all day, quietly released. She stepped into him, barely, just enough that their bodies aligned. "Good," she whispered. "It should." Because what they were building wasn't fragile, it was earned, and anything earned was worth defending. Outside, engines started again. Guards repositioned. The compound shifted into higher alert. Inside the office, Savannah rested her forehead briefly against Marcus's chest, not in surrender, not weakness, just acknowledgement. The war wasn't here yet, but it was coming. And this time, they were ready for it.
Chapter 22. Cash. Cash had learned a long time ago that fear wasn't loud. It was quiet, controlled, and methodical. That was exactly what he felt as he watched Savannah move through the compound the next morning like she belonged there. She had stopped near the picnic tables outside the main hall, where 3 of the club's old ladies had pulled her into what looked like an easy conversation. He couldn't hear a word of it from where he stood at the railing, but he could see the shape of it clearly enough. One of them said something that made Savannah tip her head back and laugh, a real one, unguarded and unself-conscious, and the sound carried just far enough to reach him without letting him in on the joke. She looked relaxed in a way she rarely allowed herself inside the meeting rooms, her shoulders loose, her hands moving as she talked, and the women around her had the easy body language of people who had decided they liked her. Cash watched that and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the threat outside the gates. She wasn't rattled by the SUV from the day before, wasn't looking over her shoulder or shrinking her presence. If anything, she seemed sharper, more deliberate, and that unsettled him more than panic would have because it meant she had accepted the risk and decided it wasn't enough to push her away. He stood near the railing outside the clubhouse, arms folded, scanning the perimeter while pretending he wasn't tracking her every move, reminding himself that protecting someone didn't mean caging them, even when every instinct in his body demanded exactly that. The outlaw's appearance hadn't been random. He knew men like that didn't waste fuel or time without purpose, and the message had been simple. We see you, we see her, and we're not afraid to show it. What they didn't understand was that intimidation only worked on people who had something to hide, and thanks to Savannah's strategy, the Blood Reapers were about to look cleaner than they ever had. Still, the club's reputation wasn't what kept him awake. It was the thought of Savannah becoming leverage in a game that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with power. He pushed off the railing and headed inside, already mapping contingencies in his head, already planning responses to threats that hadn't fully formed yet. In the meeting room, Ryder was reviewing security rotations with 2 of the senior members, his tone calm but edged with authority. Cash joined without fanfare, listening as adjustments were made to patrol schedules and gate protocols. They weren't at war, not officially, but they were no longer operating under the illusion of peace either, and that shift required discipline, not emotion. Cash contributed where necessary, issuing directives about surveillance expansion and vehicle tracking without raising his voice. The men responded without question because they could feel the change in the air. The outlaws had crossed from rumor into reality, and that meant everyone tightened ranks. Savannah entered midway through the discussion, laptop in hand, posture straight, expression focused, and every head in the room subtly adjusted in acknowledgement of her presence. She didn't wait for an invitation to speak. She projected updated reports onto the wall and began outlining the next phase of financial disclosures that would effectively corner the outlaws into either compliance or exposure. Cash watched the way she commanded attention without raising her volume, the way she anticipated objections before they were voiced, and he felt a surge of respect that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with capability. She wasn't standing behind him, she was standing beside him, and the club was starting to understand that distinction. When the meeting ended, Cash walked with her toward the side office, their steps unconsciously synchronized. And once the door closed, the professional mask slipped just enough for truth to enter the room. "Did you regret it?" he asked. "Staying last night, after the SUV?" Savannah set her laptop down and considered him without rushing the answer.
No.
"Not even a little?"
Fear existed.
she said evenly.
It still does. But it doesn't own me, and it didn't change my decision.
She held his gaze.
Is that what you needed to hear, or were you hoping I'd admit I was shaken so you'd have a reason to pull me back from this?
Cash was quiet for a beat. "Neither. I just needed to know where you were."
Now you know.
That answer did something to him. It stripped away the illusion that strength meant absence of fear and replaced it with something far more powerful. Choice. She was choosing to stand here, choosing to engage, and choosing him and the club despite knowing the risks. That realization settled heavily in his chest. Cash stepped closer, not to dominate, but to anchor. "The security expansion is going to include your apartment," he said. "That part isn't negotiable." She arched a brow, then said,
Okay?
"You're not going to argue."
No, because you're not wrong.
She tilted her head slightly.
There's a difference between you controlling a situation and you reading it correctly. I can tell which one this is.
He held her gaze for a moment, then reached out and brushed his thumb lightly along her jaw, a touch that carried promise rather than possession. The Outlaws made a mistake showing themselves this early. Savannah's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in agreement.
Men who rely on intimidation usually underestimate patience.
As the afternoon stretched on, Cash coordinated with external contacts to accelerate compliance filings, while Savannah refined documentation that would trigger automated audits if tampered with. Together they built a net so tight that even he felt the inevitability of it. The Outlaws thought they were circling prey, but what they were really doing was walking into a spotlight, and Cash intended to flip that switch himself. By the time the sun dipped low behind the clubhouse, casting long shadows across the lot, he understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about defending territory anymore. It was about building something resilient enough that no threat, legal or violent, could fracture it. And if the Outlaws wanted to escalate beyond intimidation, they would find that the Blood Reapers were no longer reacting. They were prepared. He had built his life on control, not the illusion of it, but the disciplined, calculated kind that came from anticipating threats before they fully formed. And as night settled over the compound, he stood overlooking the lot, watching the increased patrol rotations move like clockwork beneath the floodlights. The Outlaws' appearance had not rattled the club publicly, but beneath the surface every man felt the shift, and he carried the weight of that awareness without letting it fracture his composure. Leadership meant absorbing fear so others didn't have to. And while Savannah had chosen to stand beside them, he refused to let that choice become a vulnerability the enemy could exploit. He replayed the image of the SUV in his mind, analyzing posture, timing, vehicle placement, and the calculated pause before departure, because nothing about it had been impulsive. It had been reconnaissance disguised as arrogance. They wanted a reaction, wanted instability. They wanted to see if the Blood Reapers would scramble, but instead they had triggered something far more dangerous. Focus. Cash had already dispatched 2 trusted members to quietly trace the vehicle's origin through traffic cameras and informal contacts, not because he expected immediate answers, but because pressure applied steadily was more effective than retaliation delivered emotionally. War, if it came, would not be fought in parking lots. It would be fought through leverage. Savannah entered his office without knocking, a habit she had earned rather than assumed, and closed the door behind her with the calm assurance of someone who understood that conversations inside these walls mattered.
The compliance filings have been expedited,
she said, pulling up the documentation on her laptop and turning the screen toward him.
Everything is structured so the paper trail speaks for itself. If the Outlaws try to fabricate allegations, the documentation collapses it before it gets traction.
Cash studied the screen, then looked at her. "You built it to work offensively."
I built it to be honest,
she said.
Which happens to work offensively against people who aren't.
He stepped closer, sharing the weight of the moment without crowding her. "Surveillance outside your apartment has already been arranged. It was done this afternoon." She nodded once, adjusting her laptop bag on her shoulder without drama.
I figured it would be.
"You're not going to push back on that?"
I'm not unreasonable, Marcus.
She met his eyes.
I understand the difference between you needing to control something and you making a necessary call.
He held that for a moment, then said, "They'll escalate again once they realize the intimidation didn't land. Probably financial manipulation next, or indirect pressure on the fronts."
Good.
Savannah said.
Escalation without substance accelerates their own exposure. Every move they make without substance gives us more material.
"You sound like you're looking forward to it."
I'm looking forward to finishing it.
Outside, engines revved briefly before quieting, a reminder that the compound never truly slept, and Cash found himself studying Savannah not as someone to shield, but as a partner who had stepped into the arena willingly. "If this moves from financial warfare into something physical," he said, his voice low and direct, "I will pull you out. No conversation, no negotiation. You're gone." Savannah looked at him steadily.
I know.
"I need you to mean that."
I do.
She paused.
But I need you to mean something too. If that moment comes, you move on it the same way you'd move on anything that threatened this club. No hesitation because of what's between us. You treat the situation the same.
Cash held her gaze. "You think I'd hesitate?"
I think you might.
Her voice was even, not accusatory.
And I'm asking you not to.
"Understood," he said. The word landed clean and without condition, and the mutual understanding settled between them like a contract unspoken, but binding. When she finally left to return home under escort, Cash remained at the window, watching the taillights disappear beyond the gates before turning back to his desk. He pulled open a drawer and retrieved a folder containing older intelligence on the Outlaws, scanning names, affiliations, and past conflicts, because preparation required memory as much as foresight. The SUV had been a message, but he didn't respond to messages. He dismantled the systems behind them. By the time midnight approached and the compound quieted to a low mechanical hum, he had already set in motion contingencies that would tighten around their rivals like a slow, deliberate vice. He was protecting a future he had chosen, and he did not lose what he chose to fight for.
Chapter 23, Savannah. Savannah refused to let the escort vehicle behind her feel like a cage, even though she was acutely aware of its presence in her rearview mirror as she drove home under the heavy quiet of night. The streets were calmer than usual, city lights reflecting across her windshield in fractured streaks. She focused on the rhythm of the road instead of the implications of needing protection. She had chosen this path with clear eyes, yet the reality of it settled differently when she pulled into her apartment complex and noticed the subtle repositioning of two unfamiliar cars parked strategically near the entrance, vehicles that blended in but were undeniably deliberate. Marcus had not exaggerated. He had fortified. Inside her apartment, the silence felt louder than it had in weeks. She moved through the rooms methodically, checking locks and setting her laptop on the kitchen counter before pouring a glass of water she didn't immediately drink. The Outlaw's appearance at the compound replayed in her mind, not as a source of fear, but as a puzzle demanding resolution. Intimidation without action meant they were waiting for leverage, and leverage required access, so she began reviewing her digital security protocols again, layering additional encryption measures over sensitive communications and rerouting backups to secure cloud partitions only she controlled. If they were watching her physically, she would ensure they could not reach her digitally. Her phone vibrated softly against the counter, Marcus's name illuminating the screen, and she allowed herself a small exhale before answering because hearing his voice grounded her in ways she refused to articulate aloud. He asked if she was inside safely. His tone steady but edged with vigilance, and she confirmed without dramatics, updating him briefly on the added safeguards she had implemented. There was comfort in the efficiency of their conversation, in the way concern did not erode competence, and when he told her the compound was quiet but alert, she pictured him standing in his office, posture rigid against the window as he surveyed the lot. The image tightened something low in her chest. After ending the call, Savannah moved to her desk and opened a secondary file she had been building quietly over the past week, one that mapped not only shell corporations, but personal affiliations tied to the Outlaws' upper ranks. Patterns were emerging now, subtle overlaps between vendors and municipal contracts that suggested influence rather than coincidence. The discovery sharpened her focus. If the outlaws were leveraging intimidation, they were also leveraging infrastructure, and exposing that would require precision rather than speed. She leaned back in her chair, considering the implications, and understood that the battle forming wasn't just about club territory. It was about legitimacy. The following morning began without incident, sunlight spilling across her living room as if nothing had shifted in the world beyond her windows. Yet Savannah sensed the undercurrent the moment she checked her email. A notification from an anonymous sender flagged an attempted access breach, minor but deliberate, testing firewall thresholds in a way that felt more probing than accidental. She didn't panic. She documented the attempt, traced the originating IP through secure channels, and sent a concise message to Marcus detailing the timestamp and digital signature. The outlaws were escalating, not loudly but persistently, and that persistence told her they were growing impatient. By midday, she was back at the compound, laptop in hand, expression calm despite the tension coiling beneath the surface. The guards nodded her through without hesitation, their respect now grounded in familiarity rather than curiosity. As she stepped into the clubhouse, she felt the shift immediately. Conversations lowered slightly, attention sharpening as she passed. This was no longer an outsider walking into unfamiliar territory. She was part of the operational core whether anyone spoke it aloud or not. Marcus met her near the office, his gaze searching her face for signs of strain she refused to display, and she handed him a printed summary of the breach attempt without preamble. He scanned the page quickly, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He asked if she had contained it. She nodded once and explained how the trace suggested contracted interference rather than independent hackers, implying resources and intent aligned with the Outlaws network. The information landed heavily but not chaotically. It reinforced what they already suspected, and Marcus's focus shifted from reactive to decisive.
They're pushing,
He said quietly. And they'll keep pushing until something cracks, Savannah replied evenly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear.
Nothing cracks.
It wasn't bravado, it was a promise. Savannah held his gaze and felt the gravity of what they were standing inside of, the invisible line between strategic maneuvering and open conflict drawing closer with each. The Outlaws were testing pressure points from every angle now: physical presence, digital probing, silent intimidation, and yet each attempt only tightened the alignment between her and Marcus. If they wanted instability, they were achieving the opposite. As they entered the office together to brief Ryder and the senior members, Savannah understood with unmistakable clarity that this was no longer about prevention. It was about exposure. The Outlaws had revealed themselves in fragments, and she intended to assemble those fragments into something undeniable. This wasn't just defense anymore. It was preparation for a strike that would not require bullets to be devastating. Savannah stood at the head of the long table in the Blood Reaper's meeting room, the glow of the projection screen casting sharp light across her face as she outlined the breach attempt with clinical precision, refusing to dramatize what was already obvious. The men seated around the table listened without interruption, their usual restlessness replaced with focused silence as she explained how the intrusion had been structured to test response time rather than extract data. She moved through the technical breakdown steadily, identifying digital signatures, routing anomalies, and contracted server paths that suggested outsourced interference, rather than a lone hacker acting independently. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a moment longer, not from confusion but from comprehension. Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the data as though memorizing it, and then shifted his attention to Ryder, who gave a slow nod that signaled alignment rather than doubt. The pattern was clear now: physical intimidation at the gates, digital probing at her apartment, and calculated pauses in between designed to unsettle without provoking open retaliation. Savannah clasped her hands lightly in front of her and stated what no one had yet voiced aloud, explaining that the Outlaws were building a narrative framework, creating small disturbances that could later be framed as instability within the Reaper's operations. The strategy was subtle, but subtle strategies often cause the most damage if left unchecked. Marcus stood and moved beside her, not eclipsing her presence, but reinforcing it, and addressed the room with controlled authority, making it clear that every escalation from this point forward would be met with documented countermeasures rather than impulsive reaction. He issued directives for expanded digital monitoring, third-party oversight acceleration, and discrete intelligence gathering through allied channels that had remained dormant until now. The men responded with quiet affirmation, the absence of raised voices signaling discipline rather than indifference. Savannah watched the shift in posture around the table and recognized something important. The club was no longer reacting defensively. It was operating offensively with restraint. Once the meeting adjourned, she and Marcus remained behind, the door closing softly as the others filtered out, leaving behind the faint echo of boots against concrete. Savannah powered down the projector and gathered her notes, aware of the heaviness settling between them not as tension, but as inevitability. The Outlaws had revealed enough to justify decisive exposure, and she informed Marcus that she had compiled preliminary documentation linking municipal contracts to shell vendors affiliated with their rivals. If corroborated, the findings would not just embarrass the Outlaws, they would fracture the legitimacy they relied upon to operate comfortably in public spaces. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice, and asked how soon the documentation could be formalized for external review. Savannah answered without hesitation that 48 hours would be sufficient if she worked without interruption, though she acknowledged that once the filings were submitted, retaliation would likely intensify. He studied her carefully, not questioning her resolve, but measuring the cost of what she was proposing, and then gave a single nod that carried both approval and acceptance. There would be no half measures now. Exposure meant commitment. Later that evening, Savannah returned to her apartment under escort once more, but this time the drive felt different. Not because the threat had diminished, but because the direction had crystallized. She no longer felt like a target under observation. She felt like an architect finalizing structural reinforcements before unveiling a design meant to withstand pressure. Inside, she set her laptop on the desk and began refining the evidence chain, cross-referencing timestamps, financial transfers, and contractual anomalies until the connections formed an undeniable web. Each line she drew tightened the narrative the Outlaws had attempted to obscure. Her phone buzzed just after midnight with a brief message from Marcus, confirming that additional security measures were in place at the compound and that all members had been briefed on communication discipline. She replied with a simple acknowledgement before returning to her work, knowing that reassurance did not require elaborate sentiment when trust had already been established through action. Outside her window, the city lights flickered in quiet indifference, unaware of the strategic war unfolding beneath its surface. By the time dawn approached, Savannah leaned back in her chair and reviewed the compiled dossier one final time, recognizing that what lay before her was more than defensive documentation. It was leverage constructed carefully and lawfully. The Outlaws had attempted to destabilize through intimidation and probing interference, but their persistence had left fingerprints in places they could not easily erase. Savannah saved the encrypted file to multiple secure locations and allowed herself a slow, steady breath. The next move would not be loud, and it would not involve confrontation in parking lots or public displays of dominance. It would arrive in the form of formal inquiries, compliance reviews, and exposure that forced their rivals into a corner of their own making. As the first light of morning spilled across her desk, Savannah understood with unshakable clarity that escalation was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The difference now was that when the Outlaws realized the ground beneath them was shifting, it would already be too late to steady themselves.
Chapter 24. Cash, Cash did not believe in coincidence, and when the first official inquiry notice arrived at the Outlaws' primary contracting office less than 12 hours after Savannah finalized her dossier, he understood that timing was everything. He stood in his office at the compound, phone pressed to his ear, as one of his external compliance contacts confirmed that preliminary reviews had been initiated quietly and without fanfare. There would be no public spectacle, no dramatic raids, just structured scrutiny delivered through formal channels that demanded documentation the Outlaws would struggle to provide cleanly. Cash ended the call slowly, absorbing the gravity of what had just begun, knowing that once institutions started asking questions, silence became impossible to maintain. Downstairs, the clubhouse operated under controlled calm, members handling routine tasks with disciplined normalcy, yet an undercurrent of anticipation threaded through the building. Cash descended the stairs and entered the main room, where Ryder waited near the bar, arms folded, expression steady but alert. Without raising his voice, Cash informed him that the first inquiry had landed and that additional reviews would likely cascade over the next few days. Ryder nodded once, understanding that the war had shifted from intimidation to exposure, and exposure was far harder to counter without incriminating reaction. Savannah arrived mid-morning, her posture composed but her eyes sharp with awareness, and Cash felt a surge of respect as she crossed the room toward him without hesitation. She did not ask whether the inquiry had gone through. She read the answer in his expression before he spoke. He told her it had begun exactly as projected, and she responded with a quiet acknowledgement rather than triumph, because this was not a victory yet, merely the opening movement in a longer sequence. The discipline she maintained steadied the room more effectively than celebration ever could. Inside the meeting office, they reviewed contingency projections together, mapping possible responses from the Outlaws ranging from public denial to aggressive diversion tactics. Savannah outlined how further financial discrepancies might surface once auditors applied pressure, explaining that secondary shell entities often unraveled when primary documentation failed under scrutiny. Cash listened intently, absorbing not just the strategy but the patience required to execute it properly. He had built his reputation on decisive action, yet this form of warfare required stillness, and he trusted her enough to embrace that shift. By early afternoon, word filtered back through informal channels that the Outlaws were already reacting internally, scrambling to assemble paperwork and redirect attention toward unrelated community initiatives designed to polish their public image. Cash received the update without visible reaction, though inwardly he recognized the predictable pattern of men attempting to outrun consequence. He instructed the club to maintain absolute silence publicly. No commentary, no celebration, no acknowledgement of unfolding events, because power often resided in restraint. Later, as the compound settled into evening rhythm, Cash stood beside Savannah outside near the edge of the lot, the air cooling as daylight faded. He told her quietly that escalation might not remain confined to paperwork, that men cornered by exposure often lashed out physically when control slipped through their fingers. She met his gaze steadily and replied that she understood the risk but refused to regret the move, because allowing intimidation to dictate action would have cost them far more in the long run. The certainty in her voice reinforced his own. As engines rumbled softly in the distance and patrol rotations shifted under the glow of floodlights, Cash realized that the nature of the conflict had permanently changed. The Outlaws were no longer circling. They were being examined under a lens they could not easily shatter. He slipped his hand into Savannah's, not as a display but as quiet solidarity, and told her that whatever came next would be faced together, strategically and without panic. The night stretched forward heavy with anticipation, and Cash understood with calm clarity that Chapter 24 was not about reaction, it was about endurance, because once systems began to crack, they rarely did so quietly. Cash Bennett knew the silence wouldn't last. Pressure never unfolded quietly for long, and by the second day of formal inquiries, the Outlaws' composure began to fracture in ways only someone accustomed to watching men under strain would recognize. Calls that once went unanswered were suddenly returned. Public appearances were abruptly scheduled. Charitable donations were announced with conspicuous timing. Cash observed it all from a distance, absorbing reports without comment, because desperation disguised as confidence was still desperation. Late afternoon brought the first real shift. Ryder entered Cash's office without knocking, shutting the door firmly behind him before speaking, and the look on his face told Cash this wasn't routine intelligence. One of their external contacts had confirmed that a mid-level outlaw affiliate was being quietly questioned about discrepancies tied to municipal supply contracts, and more importantly, that the questioning had caught him unprepared. Unprepared men talked, not always out of betrayal, but out of fear. Cash stood slowly from behind his desk, processing the information with deliberate calm rather than visible satisfaction. The Outlaws had built their strength on image and cohesion. If even one link weakened under scrutiny, the illusion of invincibility would begin to erode. He asked for confirmation of timelines, of locations, of who else might be implicated, and Ryder supplied what details he had without embellishment. This was no longer theoretical exposure. It was an active fracture. Savannah arrived moments later, summoned not by panic but by necessity. And when Cash relayed the update, she didn't react emotionally. She moved immediately into analysis, explaining that mid-level affiliates were often the least insulated and therefore the most vulnerable under audit pressure. If this individual had handled documentation directly, inconsistencies would compound rapidly once cross-referenced. Her composure underlined the gravity of the situation more effectively than alarm ever could. As evening settled over the compound, the air shifted. Not dramatically, not violently, but tangibly. A call came in from one of the gate guards reporting a lone rider idling just beyond the property line, engine humming without advancing. Cash stepped outside with Ryder, Savannah remaining just inside the doorway but within view, and the rider removed his helmet slowly, revealing a familiar outlaw lieutenant whose confidence had been unshakable only days before. He did not cross the line. He did not speak loudly. He simply stared. Cash held the gaze without stepping forward. Power did not require movement. After a long moment, the rider called out calmly that misunderstandings could be resolved without government interference, that clubs handled matters internally when respect remained intact. The implication was clear. Withdraw the pressure, and the tension would dissolve. Cash did not raise his voice when he responded that respect was maintained through conduct, not intimidation, and that external scrutiny was a consequence of choices, not provocation. The rider's jaw tightened, but he did not escalate. He replaced his helmet, revved the engine once in restrained frustration, and pulled away into the night. Savannah stepped outside once he disappeared, the cool air brushing against her hair as she joined Cash near the edge of the lot. She did not ask what had been said. She had heard enough. Instead, she observed quietly that the Outlaws were beginning to feel the weight of exposure, and that men accustomed to controlling narratives struggled when narratives shifted beyond their reach. Cash turned toward her, studying her expression for any hint of doubt, and found none. He told her plainly that the offer to resolve misunderstandings would likely be followed by stronger tactics if intimidation failed to produce retreat. She nodded once, acknowledging the inevitability without fear, and replied that retreat had never been the objective. The compound lights cast long shadows across the pavement as patrol rotations continued seamlessly around them, a visible reminder that discipline remained intact. Cash reached for her hand again, not as reassurance, but as recognition of shared consequence, and understood with clarity that whatever escalation followed would test more than strategy. It would test resolve. Behind them, inside the clubhouse, the Blood Reapers operated with steady purpose, unaware of the precise moment when exposure would fully detonate but prepared for its impact. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond the dark stretch of road, the Outlaws were regrouping, calculating their next move under mounting pressure. Cash exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. The fracture had begun, and fractures, once started, did not reverse. They widened.
Chapter 25, Savannah. The morning arrived softly, pale light pressing through the gap in the curtains and settling across the room in a way that felt nothing like an alarm. Savannah lay still for a moment, aware before she was fully awake that she was not in her own bed. The sheets smelled different. The weight beside her was different. The quality of quiet was different. She turned her head slowly. Marcus was already awake, lying on his back with one arm behind his head, staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a man whose mind had been running for hours. He sensed her movement and looked down at her. The expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, unguarded and present.
Morning.
He said. Morning. She pushed her hair back and looked around the room properly for the first time. It was spare in the way that suited him. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. A dresser, a desk with a lamp, a chair with his cut draped over the back, and the window faced east.
You stayed.
He said. And there was something in the way he said it that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite relief, but was something between the two. I stayed, she confirmed. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the same careful deliberateness he had used the night before, and she let herself stay still under the touch instead of deflecting it. They did not rush. They lay there in the early quiet while the compound gradually woke up around them, engines turning over in the distance, voices carrying faintly across the yard, the particular sounds of a place that never entirely slept. Savannah found it less jarring than she expected. There was a rhythm to it. Eventually, Marcus sat up.
Breakfast?
Here?
No.
He looked at her.
There's a diner about 15 minutes out. Good eggs. Bad coffee. Why would I want bad coffee? Because the eggs make up for it.
He stood, picking up his shirt from the floor.
And because I want to take you somewhere that isn't this compound for an hour.
She considered him for a moment. All right. The diner was exactly as advertised. Formica countertops, a bell above the door that announced every arrival with a waitress named Donna, who called everyone honey without irony and refilled coffee before you asked. The eggs were very good. The coffee was, as promised, not. They sat across from each other in a booth near the window, and the ordinariness of it was striking after weeks of strategy sessions and late nights and the constant low hum of threat. Marcus ordered without looking at the menu. Savannah looked at the menu and ordered the same thing anyway. You come here often? She asked.
When I need to think outside the compound.
And today? He looked at her over his cup.
Today I wanted to take you to breakfast.
She held his gaze for a moment, then looked out the window at the ordinary Sunday morning street. I looked at you last night, she said, and I thought, I have no idea how I ended up here.
Good or bad?
She considered that honestly. Neither, just true. He was quiet for a moment.
I used to eat alone in this booth,
he said.
I preferred it that way. No conversation, no performance, just the eggs and the thinking.
And now?
Now I brought you.
He said it plainly, without embellishment, and it landed exactly the way plainness did when it came from someone who didn't use words carelessly. Donna refilled their coffee without being asked and moved on. Outside, a dog tied to a parking meter watched the street with complete seriousness. I have been working on something, Savannah said, wrapping both hands around her cup. Something I have not fully brought to you yet, because I needed to be sure enough of it before I said it out loud. Marcus set down his coffee.
Tell me.
Elaine. She watched his expression. I know what Ghost found. I know she was feeding my work to the consortium the entire time I was embedded with the club. I have been sitting with that since you sent me the message about it. She kept her voice level, which took more effort than she let show, because the particular quality of that betrayal still had an edge to it. A woman she had worked under for 3 years, who had briefed her on the assignment, who had warned her to be thorough and careful, had been the leak the entire time. Not a stranger, her supervisor. I have also been building something from it.
What kind of something?
Marcus said. Elaine did not do this for ideology. She did it for money, and money leaves a trail even when people are careful. Elaine was not as careful as she needed to be. She met his eyes. I went back through every stage of the audit, every report I submitted, every extension I requested, and mapped where the information moved after it left my hands. She has a consulting retainer registered under a separate entity, set up 8 months before I was assigned to the club. The payments correlate directly with key points in my audit timeline. 3 of them landed within days of me flagging significant findings. Marcus was very still. She was not just passing along information, Savannah continued. She was being paid for specific intelligence at specific moments, which means someone inside the consortium was directing her, telling her what they needed and when. She set down her cup. Once I close the final thread, what I have does two things. It invalidates anything the consortium has tried to use against the club from that audit, because the audit itself was compromised by their own interference, and it opens a formal investigation into the consortium for corrupting a licensed regulatory process.
How close are you to closing it?
Days, maybe less. She held his gaze. Donna refilled their coffee without being asked and moved on. Outside, the dog tied to the parking meter had given up watching the street and was sitting down.
Your eggs are getting cold,
Marcus said. She looked at her plate. So are yours. They ate, as the diner went about its ordinary Sunday morning business. Savannah thought about 3 years of professional trust that had been a transaction from the beginning, and felt the particular clean anger of someone who had stopped grieving a betrayal and started making it useful. He followed her home afterward, his bike pulling into her building's parking lot behind her car with an ease that suggested he had thought about doing this for a while. Savannah noticed, but didn't comment. She led him up to her apartment and unlocked the door and stepped aside. He came in slowly, and she watched him take it in the way she imagined he took in every new space. Methodically, quietly. His eyes moved over the clean lines of the living room, the white walls, the open shelving above the desk that held books arranged by size, the kitchen counter with its one good knife block, and the African violet on the windowsill that she had kept alive for 3 years through sheer stubbornness.
It's very you,
He said. Is that an observation or a compliment?
Both?
He moved toward the window and looked out at the street below, and she wondered if he was clocking the parked cars he had placed there or simply looking at her city from her angle. Maybe both. She put the kettle on. Coffee that's actually good this time.
I wasn't complaining about Donna's.
You should have been. She leaned against the counter. I want to show you what I have on Elaine, all of it. He turned from the window.
Now?
You drove here. We have time. She gestured toward the desk. And I want your eyes on something I've been looking at so long I might be missing something. He pulled up the second chair and sat beside her while she opened the laptop and walked him through the file. The Elaine dossier spread across the screen in clean, annotated columns, and Marcus read through it with the focused silence of someone used to finding the thing that didn't belong. He asked 2 questions, sharp ones. She answered both and felt the satisfaction of having already accounted for what he was looking at.
The maiden name account,
He said.
How was it discovered?
Public records cross-reference. The account was opened under her name before she married. It went dormant for years and then received 2 significant deposits that don't correspond to any public record income source. She pulled up the timestamp overlay, both within 72 hours of contract approvals. The 3rd approval I've flagged doesn't have a corresponding deposit yet, which either means the payment was made differently or it hasn't cleared my verification channels.
She's being paid in installments.
Or the 3rd approval was leverage rather than transaction, a favor banked for later. She looked at him. Either way, once I confirm the 3rd connection, this becomes a package that hands counsel everything they need to initiate a formal inquiry that doesn't look targeted. Marcus sat back and looked at the screen for a long moment.
She's going to know something is coming.
Eventually, which is why I want the verification complete before anything moves. She paused. He reached over and pulled her toward him by the back of her neck, pressing his mouth to her forehead in a way that was both tender and exasperated. She let him. She understood the language of it. Enough about her. Tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this, Savannah said. Marcus looked at her.
What do you mean?
I mean, we have been in the same rooms for months, and almost everything we know about each other came through a crisis. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I want to know something ordinary, something that existed before all of this. He considered that for a moment with the seriousness he brought to everything, as if the question deserved the same precision as a ledger entry.
I grew up counting money,
He said.
Not my family's, other people's. My uncle ran a card game out of a back room, and I was the kid who sat in the corner and kept track, because nobody thought a 10-year-old was worth watching.
He looked at his cup.
I was always better with numbers than people trusted me to be.
That is not ordinary, she said. That is formative.
You said something that existed before all of this. That qualifies.
She smiled at that. Fair enough. She turned her cup in her hands. I used to organize my mother's bills when I was 8, not because she asked me to, but because they were in a pile on the counter, and the pile bothered me. I sorted them by due date and made a little chart. She paused. She cried when she saw it. I did not understand why at the time.
Did you later?
Later, I understood that she had been drowning and her 8-year-old had just handed her a map out. Savannah looked out the window. Numbers were always the way I took care of people, even before I knew that was what I was doing. Marcus was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned meant he was not done thinking, just not ready to speak yet.
My mother kept a ledger,
He said.
Old notebook, soft cover, entries in pencil, everything the household spent every week for 20 years. I found it after she died.
He looked at the table.
Every entry was precise. She never missed a week. I did not know what to do with it, so I kept it.
Savannah looked at him. Do you still have it?
It's in my desk at the compound.
He met her eyes.
I have never told anyone that.
We are going to be fine, she said quietly, not as reassurance, as a thing she had assessed and found to be true. Marcus looked at her with the unguarded expression she was still getting used to, the one that had no calculation in it.
Yeah,
He said.
we are. Your coffee is better than Donna's.
He said against her hair. Everything is better than Donna's coffee. He stayed another hour, sitting in her kitchen while she made them both lunch from what was in her refrigerator. The ease of it was something she had not expected and did not take for granted. When he finally stood to leave, he kissed her at the door without hurry, and she watched him walk down the hall and thought that something had shifted this morning that did not have a name yet but was real, and that was enough for now. Chapter 26, Savannah. The message from Elaine arrived Monday morning, as if the woman had timed it to land when Savannah was 2 sips into her first coffee and not yet fully armored. Hi, Savannah. I hope things are well. I've been meaning to reach out for a while. Would you have time for coffee this week? There are a few things I'd like to discuss. Nothing urgent. Just talk. Savannah read it twice. Then she sat with it. Nothing urgent. Just talk. The phrasing of someone who wanted to appear casual and had thought carefully about how to do so. Savannah pulled up the Elaine file and looked at the third unverified approval, the one she hadn't been able to close yet, and felt the shape of the thing shift slightly. She called Marcus. Elaine just contacted me, she said when he answered. A beat of silence.
When?
This morning. She's asking me to coffee. Her framing is casual, nothing urgent. Savannah looked at the message again. She reached out to me, which means either she's nervous about something and thinks I can reassure her, or someone told her to make contact and she's following instructions. Or both, Marcus said. Or both.
You want to go?
I want to go because if she reached out first, she's more likely to talk. And I'm closer to closing the verification gap than I was 2 days ago. If she confirms anything in that conversation, we're done waiting. She paused. I also don't want her to know we're on to her. If I decline and she's working for someone, they'll know the avoidance means something. Another silence. Longer this time.
Where?
He said. I haven't replied yet. I'll suggest somewhere I choose.
Public, high-foot traffic, near a main road.
I know. She pulled up a map on her other screen. There's a coffee place on Renner Street. Corner location with glass frontage and 2 entrances. Parking lot on the east side.
Send me the address before you confirm.
I will. She hesitated. Marcus.
Yeah.
She doesn't know what I know. I go in as a colleague, nothing more. The conversation stays on her terms. She kept her voice steady. I need you to trust that I understand how to do this.
I trust you.
He said.
I don't trust her.
You don't need to. That's my job. She could hear him thinking on the other end of the line, the particular silence of a man who had learned, with significant effort, to let the person beside him work without interference.
All right,
He said.
but 2 people inside the cafe and 2 on the street. Non-negotiable.
Agreed. She looked at the message again. I'll set it for Wednesday. Wednesday arrived gray and unremarkable, the kind of morning that didn't announce itself. Savannah dressed carefully in semi-professional clothes she had worn at the beginning of all this, when she had been nothing more than the club's accountant and the threat had been theoretical. She wanted to look the part she had been then, someone with access and expertise, and no particular reason to be suspicious of anything. The cafe on Renner Street was already half full when she arrived 10 minutes early. She chose a table by the window where she could see both the door and the street, ordered a flat white, and set her phone on the table with the screen face down. She had spotted two of Marcus's people before she sat down, one reading a newspaper at the bar counter, which no one did anymore and was therefore conspicuous to her but probably invisible to Elaine. One outside with coffee, leaning against the wall near the eastern entrance in a way that looked like a man killing time. She did not look for the others. Elaine arrived 4 minutes late, which Savannah suspected was deliberate. She was in her mid-40s, neat in the way of someone who managed their appearance carefully. Brown hair cut sensibly, a blazer that said city official rather than corporate. She smiled when she saw Savannah, and the smile was practiced in a way that might not have registered to someone who wasn't looking for it. "Savannah, thank you for making time." She sat and waved the server over. "I was so glad you replied." "Of course. It's been a while." Savannah kept her tone warm and unhurried. They spent the first 10 minutes on nothing, the kind of professional small talk that served as calibration. Elaine mentioned a mutual contact, mentioned a conference she had attended and the weather. Savannah responded appropriately and watched the woman's eyes. Elaine was nervous. Not visibly, but in the way a careful person was nervous, everything slightly over-controlled, every pause slightly too calculated. "I heard you've been doing some consulting work on your time off," Elaine said, setting down her cup with deliberate casualness. "Some," Savannah said. "Private sector?" "Mostly. Some compliance work." She smiled. "Nothing as exciting as the public side." "Oh, the public side isn't exciting. It's paperwork and politics." She laughed, and the laugh was almost natural. "Actually, that's part of what I wanted to talk to you about." She leaned forward slightly. "I've been in a difficult position for a while now, professionally, and I've been wondering whether there was someone I could speak to about it." Savannah kept her expression open and interested. "What kind of difficult position?" Elaine looked down at her cup. The practiced composure dropped by a fraction. "The kind where you agree to something that seems manageable at the time, and then you realize you've agreed to more than you understood." Savannah waited. "There have been some contracts," Elaine said carefully, "that I've processed over the past year and a half. Approvals that were presented to me as standard, routine vendor management." She turned her cup on the saucer. "I signed because the paperwork was in order and I was told the vendors had been vetted." "But," Savannah said, "but I've started to wonder about the vetting process." Elaine looked up. Her eyes were doing something complicated. "I've been approached by people who are very interested in making sure those contracts stay quiet. People who are not affiliated with the city." Savannah kept her voice level. "What kind of people?" Elaine was quiet for a moment. She glanced toward the door, then back. "The kind who make deposits to accounts you forgot you had." She said it simply and without drama, as if she had been rehearsing the sentence for days and had decided the plainest version was the best one. There it was, the third connection, offered voluntarily, sitting on the table between them like something set down too carefully. "Elaine," Savannah said gently, "why are you telling me this?" The woman's expression shifted, and there, beneath the nervousness and the practiced calm, Savannah saw something she had not fully anticipated. Not remorse, but calculation. Elaine was not here to confess. She was here to feel out how much Savannah knew and whether she could be made into an ally or a problem. "I thought you might understand," Elaine said. "You work in compliance. You know how these things can look worse than they are." Savannah held her gaze and said nothing for one long, deliberate moment. "Of course," she said finally. "These things are rarely straightforward." Elaine relaxed by a degree. It was almost imperceptible. Exactly. I think there's room for a sensible resolution. If the right people approach the situation with the right framing. I'm sure there is, Savannah said pleasantly. She picked up her coffee and took a calm sip and thought, "You just told me everything I needed to know." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. Savannah gave Elaine nothing she could use, asked no questions that revealed the depth of what she already knew. She said goodbye with a warmth that was entirely professional and entirely false. She was halfway across the parking lot when her phone buzzed. It was not Marcus. It was a number she did not recognize. She stopped walking and looked at the message. "You should not have come here today." She looked up slowly, scanning the street. The black SUV was already moving. It came from the side street, not fast enough to draw attention, pulling smoothly to a stop 2 feet in front of her before she had processed that it was aimed at her. The door opened and a man she had never seen stepped out. The hand that closed around her arm was practiced and quick. She had just enough time to shout before something sharp pressed against the side of her neck. The parking lot tilted, and the last thing she saw before the gray morning went dark was the face of Marcus's man at the window of the cafe, already rising from his seat, but already too late.
Chapter 27. Marcus. He was at the compound when the call came in. Not the call he expected. Not Savannah checking in, and not a routine update from the man outside the cafe. It was Priest, one of the two inside, and his voice had the particular tightness that stripped everything else from the room the moment Marcus heard it. "She is gone. Black SUV, side entrance on Renner. We were moving before it pulled out, but they had a 30-second lead and we lost them at the junction." Marcus set down what was in his hand. He walked into the hall and said, "Get Ryder. Everyone who is not on the perimeter into the main room. Now." He had known something could go wrong. He had run the variables. He had positioned 4 people and chosen a corner location with 2 entrances and told himself the coverage was sufficient. He had trusted the plan, and the plan had a gap in it, and Savannah was in a black SUV because of it. He did not allow himself to sit with that for more than 10 seconds. Then he moved. The main room filled fast. Ryder was there in under 2 minutes, reading Marcus's face and asking no unnecessary questions. "Street cameras on Renner and every junction within 4 blocks, Marcus said. "I want the plate, the direction of travel, and any secondary camera that picked them up in the first 60 seconds after leaving the lot." "Already pulling," said Gage, already seated with 2 laptops open. "She had her phone. They will have taken it, but it may have pinged a tower before they killed it." Gage nodded without looking up. "On it." Marcus stood at the center of the room and did not pace. He mapped instead. The Outlaws had been watching the cafe, which meant someone had told them about the meeting, and there were only 2 people who knew about the meeting: himself and Savannah. Which meant Elaine had known from the beginning, had been sent to draw Savannah out. She had played the nervous administrator so convincingly that even Savannah, who was not easily convinced, had sat across from her and come away believing she had won. They had been waiting for her to leave the building. "Got something." Gage's voice cut through the room. Camera on the Renner junction picked up a black SUV partial plate heading north at the 11:17 timestamp, 2 minutes after contact. "North toward what?" Ryder said. "Following the route north toward the industrial corridor, pulling the secondary camera on Haverford now." A pause. "Got it. Haverford confirms the same vehicle turning east onto the access road toward the Strand warehouses." The room went very still. Marcus knew the Strand warehouses. Every man in that room knew the Strand warehouses. 3 decommissioned industrial buildings on the east edge of the city, partially fenced with a grid of access roads that fed nowhere useful unless you'd been using them for years. The Outlaws had defaulted to familiar ground because they had moved fast and not planned for a long hold, which meant mistakes. "They took her somewhere they know," Ryder said, "which means they planned this quickly and fell back on what was available." Marcus was already pulling on his cut. "Which is useful." He looked around the room. "We go now. We take the access road from the south, and we do not announce ourselves until I say so. No noise until we are already inside." 8 of them went. The bikes did not roar when they left the compound. They rolled out with headlights low and engines at minimum noise, moving through the city's back streets in a column that attracted nothing. Marcus rode at the front and thought with cold precision about every variable he could control and accepted, without sentiment, the ones he could not. She was alive. They had taken her as leverage, not to punish. If punishment had been the objective, they would not have needed a warehouse. That logic held. He held it the way he held numbers he trusted, firmly and without sentiment, because letting it become something emotional would slow him down, and slowing down was not available to him right now. He killed his headlight 300 meters from the access road. The others followed without instruction. They left the bikes 200 meters back and went the rest on foot through the dark with the quietness of men who had done this before and understood that noise was the enemy of outcome. The secondary warehouse had light in two of its high windows. Marcus could see the shape of two vehicles parked on the east side from 40 meters out. One of them was the black SUV. He split the group with hand signals. Ryder took 3 men around the north side toward the loading dock entrance. Marcus took the remaining 3 toward the south access door, which had a compromised lock that intelligence gathered months ago had flagged, and no one had apparently thought to fix. He gave Ryder 90 seconds. He counted them. He went through the door on 0. The warehouse interior was dark except for the lit partition at the far end, sectioned off by old shelving units, and he moved toward it with his weapon up and his eyes adjusting. The voices he could hear told him 2 men, low and unhurried, which meant they were not yet expecting company. He came around the shelving. Savannah was in a metal chair with her wrists zip-tied to the armrests. Her head was forward, hair over her face, chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone unconscious rather than gone. He registered that in under a second, and the cold thing running through him recalibrated from threat assessment to extraction. The 2 men had half a second to register his presence. Ryder came through the loading dock door on the opposite side before either of them could do anything useful with that half second. It was over quickly. The first man dropped his weapon. The second moved toward Savannah, and Marcus redirected that decision with enough force that it would not be reconsidered. 4 minutes to secure the building. 3 outlaws total, all accounted for. He left Ryder with 2 men handling containment and crossed to Savannah and crouched in front of her and put his hand against her face. Savannah. Her eyelids moved, slow and chemical. Savannah, I am here. She found his face in pieces, recognition assembling itself behind her eyes 1 layer at a time.
Marcus,
she said. Her voice was thick and approximate. I've got you. He was already cutting the zip ties. Can you stand?
give me a second.
He gave her the second. Then he gave her his arm, and she stood, unsteady but determined. He kept his hand at her back and felt the relief of a man who had run a cold for 50 minutes. She was saying something about Elaine, about the cafe, about what had been said before the parking lot, and he told her they knew and they would talk about it when they were clear of the building. He turned toward the loading dock entrance where Ryder was finishing the containment, already planning the exit route in his head, which was why he did not fully account for the fourth man. He came from the upper level, from the dark above the shelving, and Marcus heard the movement a fraction of a second before the shot, just enough time to turn, but not enough time to move entirely clear of it. The bullet went into his left side just below the ribs with a force that was nothing like what he expected. Not fire, not sharpness, but pressure, a sudden profound heaviness as if something had decided to anchor him to the ground. The fourth man did not get a second shot. Two of Marcus's men put him down before he could adjust his angle. Marcus stayed upright. He was not entirely sure how. He was aware of Savannah's hand on his arm, aware of her voice saying his name with a register he had never heard from her before, aware of Ryder crossing the distance between them at speed. "I am fine," he said, and was aware that this was not an accurate statement.
"You are not fine,"
Savannah said, with a voice that would have made him smile under different circumstances. Ryder's shoulder was under his arm. The exit was 20 meters ahead. He focused on the 20 meters. "I am getting you out of here," Ryder said. "That is the plan," Marcus said. Outside, the night was cool and entirely indifferent. Marcus let Ryder take the weight he could no longer manage on his own, and thought with the focused clarity of a man who understood that the situation required clarity, that he needed to tell someone where the Foss documentation backup was stored. He told Ryder with the last ounce of breath he could muster. Then the ground came up and he stopped arguing with it.
Chapter 28, Savannah. The drive to the hospital was the longest 14 minutes of her life. She sat in the back of Ryder's truck with Marcus's head in her lap because that was where she had ended up when they loaded him in and she was not moving. Her hands stayed pressed flat against the side of his face, not applying pressure to anything, just maintaining contact, because it was the only thing available to her, and she needed something to do with them. The sedative was still working its way out of her system, and the world had a slight unreality to it that she refused to let slow her down. Ryder drove. She did not watch the road. She watched Marcus. Lena was waiting at the trauma center on Morrison when they arrived, which meant Ryder had called ahead and Lena had moved faster than the situation's official timeline required. Savannah felt a gratitude so specific it almost undid the composure she had been holding since the warehouse. She watched them take Marcus through the double doors on a gurney, and then she stood in the corridor and breathed. Lena reappeared 30 minutes later in scrubs she had sourced from somewhere, moving with the calm authority of someone whose competence in this specific situation was not theoretical. "He is stable," she said before Savannah could speak. "The bullet passed through cleanly. Left flank, no organ involvement as far as initial assessment shows. He is going to need imaging, but he is not in immediate danger." Savannah nodded. "Sit down," Lena said. "I am fine. You were sedated 2 hours ago and you have been running on adrenaline since you woke up. Sit down." Lena looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who had made her position on unnecessary stubbornness very clear on multiple previous occasions. "I will come and find you the moment there is something to tell you." Savannah sat down. The waiting room was fluorescent and institutional and entirely indifferent to the specifics of what had brought any of its occupants there, which was, she supposed, the appropriate quality for a space designed to hold people in suspension between crisis and resolution. She sat in a plastic chair and looked at her hands and thought about the warehouse, the parking lot, and the 47 minutes between Priest's call and the moment she had opened her eyes and found Marcus crouching in front of her with his hand against her face. Ryder sat beside her. He had not left. He had parked the truck and walked back in and taken the seat next to hers without a word, because that was what Ryder did when the situation called for presence rather than action. They sat together in the fluorescent indifference for a while without talking, which was its own kind of useful. After a time, Savannah said, "The documentation is ready to move." Ryder looked at her. "I know," she said quietly. "I know he's going to be okay because they just took him for imaging, and I know tonight has been what it has been." She looked at her hands. "But they took me from a parking lot because they knew I was close, which means they know what I have been building and they are not going to sit still and wait to see what happens next." The exhaustion was real, and the sedative residue was real, and underneath both of them was something steadier and more insistent. If we move the documentation tonight, the system starts moving before they can respond to it. Ryder was quiet for a moment.
"What do you need from me?"
"The backup files are on the encrypted drive in the false bottom of my laptop bag. It came with me from the warehouse." She looked at him. "There is a contact at the Financial Crimes Unit. I have his direct number saved under the initials DC in my phone. He has been expecting a package through a specific channel for 2 weeks. If you call him and tell him it is coming tonight and that the matter is urgent, he will treat it as a priority." She paused. "I would call him myself, but I think it lands differently, coming from someone who sounds like they mean it at 2 a.m. The corner of Ryder's mouth shifted very slightly.
"I can sound like I mean it."
"I know you can." He stood.
"I will handle it."
"Thank you." He left. She sat back in the plastic chair and felt the particular exhaustion of someone whose body had been running on emergency signals for several hours and was beginning to submit its invoice. Lena came through the double doors an hour and 40 minutes later. Her expression was the expression of someone delivering information she'd already sorted into the correct categories. "He is out," she said. "The imaging confirmed no organ involvement. He's going to be in recovery for a couple of hours, and then he is going to be extremely annoying about being kept in a hospital bed." She looked at Savannah. "You can see him when he is in a room, 20 minutes. The 20 minutes passed slowly. Room 4 had the bleached quality of hospital lighting that made everything look more serious than it was, and Marcus was propped at a slight angle, with monitors and lines and the particular expression of a man who was conscious and did not fully approve of his circumstances. His color was not good. His eyes, when they found her in the doorway, were completely themselves. She pulled the chair close and sat down and looked at him.
Before you say anything,
He said. I am not going to say anything, she said.
you have a look.
I do not have a look.
You have a specific look that is the look of someone not saying something.
She held his gaze. Ryder moved the documentation tonight. The Financial Crimes Unit has everything. The Vantacore chain, Foss, Elaine, all of it. She kept her voice steady. It is done, Marcus. It was done before you came back from imaging. He was quiet for a moment. The monitors hummed steadily beside him.
You built something they could not dismantle.
He said. We built something, she said. And tonight, it lands where it was always supposed to land. He reached for her hand, and she gave it to him, and he held it with the grip of someone conserving strength, but not willing to be careless about the things that mattered.
I should have accounted for the upper level.
He said. Yes, she said. You should have. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She was not going to pretend, and he was not going to pretend, and that was one of the things that was true and solid about what they had built.
I love you,
he said, plain and without production, the way he said the things that were simply facts. I love you too, she said, and you are going to stay in this bed and let Lena do what Lena needs to do, and you are not going to be unreasonable about the timeline.
I make no promises about the timeline.
Marcus.
I will consider the timeline.
The door opened and Lena appeared with the air of someone whose visiting period was a firm boundary rather than a suggestion. Time, she said. Savannah stood and squeezed his hand once and looked at him for a moment in the hospital light, at the man who had ridden into a warehouse in the dark for her and taken a bullet at the end of it and woken up focused on the location of a documentation backup and felt the full weight of loving someone who was exactly who they were without apology or modification. Sleep, she said. I will be here when you wake up. She went back to the waiting room. Ryder was there, returning from the documentation handoff, and he sat beside her again, and they waited together in the particular companionship of people who had been through something and come out the other side of it still standing.
It is moving,
Ryder said.
The unit confirmed receipt. They are treating it as priority.
Good, she said. Outside, somewhere beyond the fluorescent walls, the city was doing what cities did, moving through its ordinary night entirely unaware that in a filing somewhere, a set of documents was assembling itself into consequence. Gerald Foss was asleep, probably, or awake and uneasy, in the specific way of people who had been building something on a foundation they suspected was not as solid as advertised. Elaine Marsh was somewhere making the calculation she had been postponing. By morning, neither of them would have the option of postponing anything. Savannah leaned back in the plastic chair and let the waiting room hold her for a while, and thought about documents and warehouses and parking lots, and a man in a hospital bed 4 doors down who had found her in the dark and would very shortly be unreasonable about his recovery timeline, and felt underneath the exhaustion and the residue of the sedative and the long, complicated weight of the night, something that was unmistakably and stubbornly peace. The arrests came through at 6:47 in the morning. Ryder showed her the confirmation on his phone, and she read it twice, and then sat with it for a moment, and then said, "Good," and meant it completely. When Marcus woke up 2 hours later, it was the first thing she told him. He held her hand and looked at the ceiling and said nothing for a long moment, and she understood the silence as the particular silence of a man whose ledger had just balanced, not with noise or celebration, but with the quiet finality of a column that had been running for months and had finally, correctly, closed.
Is it over?
He said. The worst of it, she said honestly. Yes. He turned his head and looked at her.
Stay.
I already told you I would be here when you woke up.
I mean after,
he said.
All of it. Stay.
She looked at him in the morning light coming through the hospital window, thin and honest and entirely without glamour, and thought about all the definitions of staying and which one he meant, and decided he meant all of them. Yes, she said, I will stay. Chapter 29. Savannah. The week after the arrests moved in a different register than anything that had come before it. Not celebration and not relief, exactly. More like the particular quality of air after a pressure system passes. The atmosphere changes at a cellular level. The tension that had been so constant had stopped registering its own presence, now conspicuous in its absence. Savannah sat at her kitchen table on Thursday morning with the kind of coffee that was actually good and a newspaper she was not reading, letting the quiet exist without filling it. The Foss arrest had made the local business section, framed in the careful language of financial crimes and municipal irregularities, which was accurate and incomplete and entirely sufficient for her purposes. Elaine Marsh had been named as a cooperating party in the investigation, which told Savannah everything she needed to know about the decision Elaine had ultimately made. She thought about the cafe, the practiced nervousness and the performance of reluctance. She thought about what it cost a person to make the choices Elaine had made, not just the obvious ones at the beginning when the deposits arrived and the approvals were signed, but the later ones, the ones that compounded and made the exit route narrower with each passing month. She did not feel sympathy for Elaine exactly, but she understood the architecture of it. How a person could stand at the edge of a reasonable compromise and not see clearly how far from reasonable they had already walked. She closed the newspaper. Marcus had been released from the hospital on Tuesday, 2 days earlier than the initial timeline, which Lena attributed to stubbornness and Marcus attributed to efficient healing. Savannah attributed it to the fact that he had been unbearable enough about being there that everyone involved was motivated to accelerate the process. He was at the compound resting in the specific way that men like Marcus rested, which was to say sitting at a desk going through paperwork at 60% capacity and calling it recovery. She had been there every day. She will go again this afternoon. She opened her laptop and started reviewing some files. Then she closed it again. Some things could wait. She was going to the compound. Marcus was at his desk when she arrived, left hand moving slightly more carefully than the right, the only visible concession to the wound that she had noticed him making. He looked up when she came in, and the quality of his attention when she entered a room was something she had stopped trying to rationalize and had started simply accepting. "How's the side?" she said.
Fine.
Lena's definition of fine or your definition of fine?
Somewhere between the two.
She sat in the chair across from him, the chair that had been empty the first time she walked into this office. She thought about that now and almost said it, but decided it was the kind of thing that could wait for a better moment.
The Financial Crimes Unit called,
he said.
They want a formal interview and documentation review.
He looked at her.
With you, specifically?
I expected that. She had, in fact, prepared for exactly that. When?
They suggested next week. I told them you would confirm directly.
I will, she paused. It's going to be thorough.
I know.
And some of what I tell them will reflect on the club's financial structure, even the parts we built to be clean. He met her eyes.
The parts we built to be clean will hold up.
Yes, she said. They will. She had made certain of that. It was, in some sense, the entire architecture of what she had built here. Not just defense, but foundation. Ryder knocked and came in without waiting, which was standard, but he came bringing gifts. A coffee he set on Marcus's desk, and the easy manner of a man who had slept adequately for the first time in several weeks.
Financial Crimes confirmed the second arrest warrant,
he said.
Foss's CFO, the one who processed the shell entity transfers.
He looked at Savannah.
Your documentation chain was apparently very thorough.
It was meant to be, she said.
They used the word comprehensive.
Ryder almost smiled.
Twice.
After Ryder left, Marcus looked at her for a moment and then said, "Stay tonight." It was not a question in the way that his first invitation had been. This was tentative and careful around the edges. It was simply a statement of preference from a man who had decided to be straightforward about the things that mattered. "I have clothes here," she said. She had left them 3 days ago and had not retrieved them.
I noticed.
Did it bother you?
No.
He said it without hesitation.
It didn't bother me at all.
She looked at him. at the man behind the desk with the careful posture and the eyes that had never once looked at her as a variable to be managed, despite the fact that she had arrived in his life as exactly that. She thought about the room at the cookout. She thought about the hospital corridor at 4 a.m. She thought about breakfast at a diner where the coffee was bad and the company was not. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." He nodded and went back to his paperwork. She opened her laptop and worked beside him in the comfortable silence of people who had learned each other's rhythms and found them compatible. The afternoon settled around them like something deliberate and something chosen. Outside, the compound moved with a steadiness that had been hard-won. Men worked and talked. The machines that kept the place running turned over in their reliable rhythms, and none of it felt like threat anymore. Or if it did, it felt like threat of the manageable kind. The kind that could be mapped and documented and met with preparation rather than panic. At some point, without planning it, Savannah moved from her chair to the couch along the wall, legs tucked under her and laptop balanced on her lap. Marcus moved his work to the small table beside her without comment, and they worked like that until the light through the window changed to amber. Someone knocked on the door and asked if they wanted food, and Marcus said yes without asking her because he already knew the answer. This was what it looked like, she thought. Not the drama of arrival or the sharpness of crisis or the particular electricity of two people who wanted each other and kept finding reasons to not want each other more. This was what it looked like on the other side of all that. Ordinary, and she was going to keep it. Chapter 30, Savannah. 3 months after Gerald Foss's arraignment, the Blood Reapers threw a party. Not a cookout this time. This was a night party, the full version, music that could be felt in the chest before the compound gate was even in sight. The parking lot was packed with bikes from 3 allied clubs and enough lights strung between posts to be visible from the road. Savannah arrived with Isla, who had picked her up because Marcus was already there and had been there since noon doing the things that needed doing before a party of this scale became a party rather than a disaster. "You ready for this?" Isla asked as she cut the engine. Savannah looked at the compound gate and the music pushing through it, the noise and heat of it already reaching her across the parking lot. "I think so," she said. "Good answer," Isla said, and got out of the car. Inside the gate, the scale of it hit fully. 3 clubs meant 3 times the energy, the particular charged atmosphere of men who lived fast and celebrated hard. Men who understood that the space between survival and catastrophe was sometimes very thin and worth celebrating simply because you were still on the right side of it. Savannah moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had stopped being a visitor here and had not quite named what she was. But she felt the difference in the way people made room for her without thinking about it. Lena found her first, drink in hand, with Maya a step behind. "You made it," Maya said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I made it." Savannah accepted the drink that appeared from somewhere. "Where is everyone?" "Ryder is arguing with someone from the second club about something that is definitely not important," Lena said. "Isla will be with him in approximately 4 minutes to resolve it. Diesel is at the bar." She looked at Savannah. "Marcus is out back. He's been watching the gate." Savannah turned toward the back of the compound. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her a moment she was privately grateful for. He was standing at the edge of the light with a drink he was not really drinking, talking to one of the Allied Club's officers with the easy authority of someone whose standing did not require demonstration. His left side was almost entirely back, the careful movement of the past weeks replaced with something approaching normal. The sight of him standing upright and unconstrained in the middle of a noisy night, unhurt and present and hers, hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force that she had stopped being surprised by. He saw her. The officer he had been talking to said something. Marcus said something back without looking away from her, and then he walked across the yard. The party roared on around them as he reached her, and the first thing he did was take the drink out of her hand and set it on a nearby table and replace it with his own hand.
"You're late,"
he said. "Isla drives like a reasonable person."
"That's the problem."
He looked at her. the unhurried, comprehensive way he had of looking at her that she had learned was not performance, but simply how he paid attention to things he cared about.
You look good.
"You look recovered," she said.
Fully.
He said it with just enough emphasis that she knew he was answering the question she had not asked. She laughed, and he pulled her in and kissed her with the easy confidence of someone who had stopped wondering whether this was allowed. Around them, the party went on, and someone revved an engine for no reason while music poured out of the clubhouse doors, and the night was warm and full and uncomplicated.
Come on,
He said.
Ryder's going to lose the argument he's having, and I want to watch.
She let him lead her through the crowd, his hand in hers, and thought about the first time she had walked through this compound with her chest tight and her professional armor polished to a high shine. She had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. She thought about all the things you could not predict and all the things you could, and how the accounting of a life, properly done, included both. Ryder was in fact losing the argument. Isla arrived in 3 minutes rather than 4, assessed the situation with a single look, and resolved it in under 60 seconds in a manner that left both men looking faintly embarrassed. Marcus watched the whole thing with an expression of profound satisfaction that made Savannah laugh again, properly this time, unguarded and unself-conscious in the middle of a night full of noise and people and the smell of summer and engine oil. "This is your life," she said to him.
It is.
He said. He looked at her.
Glad you stayed in it.
She was glad too. She had been glad every day since the morning she woke up in his room with pale light coming through the curtains and made a decision so quietly that it barely registered as a decision. Staying was easy when the alternative had stopped making sense. "Dance with me," she said. He looked at the space where people were moving to music with the expression of a man who did not dance. "Marcus."
I don't dance.
"You danced at the cookout."
That was a medical anomaly.
She pulled him toward the music, and he came without significant resistance, which told her everything she needed to know about how far they had come from the man who had sat across a desk from her and tried to manage the outcome of everything, including her. She thought that if she were building a ledger of this, of him and of what they were, she would mark this moment as something that balanced, not a gain against a loss, just balanced and complete. Around them, the blood reapers celebrated with the full force of people who understood the cost of the thing they were celebrating. Savannah danced badly and happily in the middle of all of it, and Marcus danced worse. The night burned bright and warm, and she was in it entirely without reservation. Epilogue. Savannah. Some things you do not see coming, not because you are not paying attention, but because attention, however sharp, cannot account for the specific shape of what turns out to matter most. I did not see Marcus coming. I saw the ledgers, the club, the threat, and the work. I saw a problem with a solution, and a solution that required my particular kind of thinking. I did not see the rest of it until it was already happening, and by the time I noticed, it had already become the fact I was building everything else around. That was a 1.5 years ago. We live in a house north of the city now, set back from the road on land that is private, without being conspicuous, the kind of place that does not announce itself. There is a porch that faces west and catches the afternoon light in a way that makes it easy to lose an hour without noticing. I have lost many hours there willingly with coffee that is very good and the particular quiet of a place that belongs to you. The compound is 20 minutes from the front door, close enough and far enough at the same time. Marcus rides there most mornings, and I drive when the work requires it. The distinction between his world and mine has not so much dissolved as aligned, two systems that once ran in parallel, finding a shared infrastructure. I still work with numbers, but the nature of the work has changed in ways that feel like growth rather than compromise. The Blood Reapers' financial operations are structured now around sustainability and defensibility, legitimate fronts that are genuinely legitimate, boundaries that are observed, because Marcus decided years ago that the line between protected and imprisoned was one he would not cross for anyone. I trust that, so I helped build the architecture of it, and I trust what I built. The Vantacore case resolved the way documentation-heavy cases resolve, slowly and then decisively. Gerald Foss accepted a plea arrangement that removed him from any position of influence and cost him most of what he had spent a decade building. Elaine Marsh cooperated fully as anticipated and received a sentence that reflected the cooperation and the culpability in equal measure. The municipal contracts were voided, the vendor chains dissolved, and the city planning office underwent an audit that produced 3 additional referrals unrelated to our investigation. Sunlight, as it turns out, covers more ground than you intend it to. The Outlaws fractured further in the months after the arrest. The internal division that Marcus had forced into the open at the warehouse vote, never fully healing under the weight of subsequent pressure. The vice president took his faction south. The president held a diminished territory with a diminished appetite for war. They are not gone and are not entirely irrelevant, but they are no longer the shape they were. The Blood Reapers operate in the space they created with the kind of confidence that comes from having tested ground and knowing it holds. Marcus was fully healed by December. He did not make a ceremony of it. He simply one day stopped moving carefully and went back to moving the way he always moved, with the controlled directness of someone who has accounted for the room and made peace with what he finds. The scar is there, and he is unremarkable about it, which is characteristic, and I have made my peace with it in the way you make peace with things that are simply true about a person you have chosen. We got married in the spring. Not a large wedding. Just the people who mattered and vows that meant what they said. A celebration that felt like a promise rather than a performance. I could see tears in Ryder's eyes, which he would deny under any interrogation, but which Isla confirmed to me privately with great satisfaction. Lena gave a toast that was clinically precise and moving. Maya brought food enough for twice the number of people present and was entirely unapologetic about it. I stood beside Marcus in front of the people who had become my people through fire rather than invitation, and said the things that were true, meant every word, and felt the particular solidity of a choice made with full information and no ambiguity. Some choices you make because the alternative is worse. Some you make because the path forward is clear. This one I made because I had been given every reason to know exactly what I was choosing, and I chose it anyway, with both eyes open and the ledger balanced, and the full understanding that the road ahead would require everything I had. I have not regretted it for a single day. The porch faces west. The afternoon light comes in at an angle that turns everything gold for about 40 minutes before it shifts to something quieter, and I have taken to being on the porch for those 40 minutes whenever I can manage it, which is most days. Marcus joins me when he is home in time. When he is not, I sit with the light and think about nothing in particular, which is a skill I have been developing and am not yet expert in, but am improving. He came home last Tuesday in time for the light. He sat beside me and put his hand over mine, and we watched the 40 minutes happen without talking about anything of consequence, which was itself a kind of consequence, the quiet demonstration that this was a place where quiet was safe. You have been listening to Ruthless LEDGER Book 5 in the Blood Reapers MC series. Please like, subscribe, and share for more. As always, we love to hear your feedback, so drop us some gems in the comments, and we will see you in the next one. The end.